Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. February 2019 was brutally cold in northern Michigan. The kind of cold that seeps into your marrow and makes itself at home. I'd been planning this solo winter survival trip for months, my 8th one in as many years. At 34, I considered myself experienced enough to handle whatever the wilderness threw at me. I'd faced blizzards, equipment failures, and once even a territorial moose. Nothing had deterred me from my annual pilgrimage into solitude. "You're out of your mind, Theo," my brother Wes had said when I told him about my plans. "Normal people go to Florida in February." I just smiled. Wes never understood the appeal. How could I explain that the isolation, the challenge, the pristine silence of a winter forest restored something in me that everyday life slowly eroded? The Pigeon River State Forest was my destination this time, 120,000 acres of wilderness about 30 miles east of Gaylord. I'd never explored this particular region before, which added an extra layer of anticipation to my preparations. New territory meant new challenges, new sights. The morning of my departure, I methodically checked my gear one final time in the dim light of my garage. The temperature gauge on my phone read -3 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect conditions for what I had in mind. Cold enough to be challenging but not immediately life-threatening. My pack contained everything I'd need for 5 days in the wilderness. Tent, sub-zero sleeping bag, fire-starting equipment, dried food, first aid supplies, maps, compass, satellite phone for emergencies only, and enough layers of specialized clothing to keep hypothermia at bay. Strapped to the outside was a small folding shovel and a hatchet, and of course my Winchester 12-gauge pump shotgun. I'd owned it for nearly a decade, and it had accompanied me on every trip. Ostensibly, it was for hunting small game to supplement my food supplies and for protection against the occasional aggressive wildlife. But there was something else, something I rarely admitted even to myself. In the vast emptiness of winter wilderness, the solid weight of the shotgun was reassuring in ways that went beyond practical considerations. I left before dawn, driving north on nearly empty highways. The sky gradually lightened to a flat, pewter gray as I made my way deeper into the northern part of the state. Gas stations and fast food restaurants gave way to small towns, which in turn yielded to snow-laden forests and fields. By 9 a.m., I had reached the small gravel parking area that would serve as my entry point. The air was still and brittle with cold as I stepped out of my truck. I took a deep breath, feeling the icy air sting my nostrils and fill my lungs. This was the moment I lived for, the threshold between civilization and wilderness, between comfort and challenge. I shouldered my pack, checked that my shotgun was unloaded and secure, and set off down the narrow trail that disappeared between the snow-dusted pines. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. The forest was silent except for the crunch of my boots on packed snow and the occasional whisper of wind through the branches overhead. Here and there, animal tracks crisscrossed the trail. Rabbit, fox, deer. I noted them with satisfaction. The forest was alive, even in the depths of winter. My plan for the first day was straightforward. Hike about 8 miles to a small clearing I'd identified on my map, set up camp, and spend the remaining daylight hours exploring the immediate vicinity. The following days would involve longer excursions, perhaps some hunting if the opportunity presented itself. By early afternoon, I'd covered about 6 miles. The trail had been challenging in places, with deep snowdrifts requiring careful navigation, but nothing I couldn't handle. I stopped in a small clearing to rest and eat a quick meal of jerky and trail mix. As I chewed methodically, I studied my map. According to my calculations, I had another 2 miles to go before reaching my intended campsite. The trail ahead appeared to wind through a dense stand of pines before emerging near a small frozen pond. Standard terrain for this part of Michigan. What the map didn't show, what no map could show, was what waited for me just beyond that stand of pines. Had I known, I would have turned back then and there, while the sun was still relatively high and the way back to my truck was clear in my mind. Instead, I repacked my food, shouldered my pack, and continued forward, oblivious to how drastically my life was about to change. The snowfall began about an hour after I resumed hiking, At first it was just a few lazy flakes drifting down through the canopy of pines. Beautiful, I thought. A perfect addition to an already perfect day. But within minutes the snow intensified and the wind picked up, driving the flakes horizontally through the trees. I paused, reassessing my situation. The weather forecast had called for clear skies until at least tomorrow afternoon. This sudden squall was unexpected but not necessarily alarming. I had the gear to handle it and my destination wasn't far. Still, something felt off. The wind had a strange quality to it. Not the steady, powerful gusts of a normal winter storm, but erratic bursts that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It made the trees creak and groan in a way that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the clearing and set up my tent before conditions worsened. The trail began to slope downward, gradually at first, then more steeply. The trees closed in on either side, creating a kind of natural tunnel. My breath came faster, forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. And then, quite suddenly, the forest opened up, and I found myself standing at the edge of what appeared to be a narrow valley. More of a ravine. Really, cutting through the landscape like a wound. This wasn't on my map. I was certain of it. I stopped, pulled off my glove with my teeth, and fumbled for the map in my inner pocket, squinting at it through the swirling snow. According to the contour lines, I should be approaching a gently rolling area leading to the pond, not this steep-sided gash in the earth. I looked up, trying to orient myself by the sun, but the sky was now completely overcast, a uniform field of white-gray that offered no clues. I was disoriented, but not yet worried. Navigation errors happen to even the most experienced hikers. The sensible thing would be to backtrack to a recognizable landmark and start over. But as I turned to look behind me, I realized with a jolt that my tracks were already nearly obscured by the rapidly accumulating snow. I checked my watch, 3:47 p.m. Daylight would be fading soon, especially with the storm overhead. Making camp here, exposed at the edge of this unexpected ravine, seemed unwise. The wind was intensifying, whistling through the gap below. But the other option, pressing forward into unknown territory as darkness approached, was equally unappealing. Unless I peered down into the ravine. Through the curtain of falling snow, I could make out what appeared to be a trail winding along the bottom. It was narrow but clear of major obstacles. More importantly, the walls of the ravine would provide shelter from the wind, which was becoming increasingly violent. And on the far side, perhaps half a mile away, I could see the forest rising again. If this ravine wasn't on my map, it must be relatively narrow, a local feature that the mapmakers had either missed or deemed too insignificant to include. If I could cross it, I might be able to regain my bearings on the other side and still reach my intended campsite before full dark. The decision made, I began to pick my way down the steep slope into the ravine. The going was treacherous. The ground was a mix of loose rocks, frozen earth, and patches of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Several times my boots lost traction and I slid a few feet before regaining control. About halfway down, I paused to catch my breath. The wind was noticeably less intense here, blocked by the walls of the ravine, but the air felt different, heavier somehow, and with an underlying dampness that hadn't been present in the forest above. And there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A smell, faint but unmistakable. Not the clean, crisp scent of a winter forest, but something earthier, mustier, like wet leaves decomposing or soil that's been turned over after a long period of being undisturbed. I wrinkled my nose, attributing the odor to some quirk of the terrain, perhaps a spring beneath the frozen ground, or a patch of vegetation that retained moisture differently than the surrounding area. Continuing my descent, I finally reached the bottom of the ravine. The trail I'd spotted from above was indeed there, winding along the lowest point between the rising walls on either side. It was surprisingly well-defined for an unmarked path, suggesting regular use. By what or whom, I couldn't say. The snowfall had eased somewhat, but the light was fading faster than I'd anticipated. I needed to move quickly if I wanted to reach the other side before darkness fell completely. I adjusted my pack, made sure my shotgun was secure on my shoulder, and set off along the trail, my footsteps eerily muffled by the fresh snow. The walls of the ravine rose on either side, growing steeper and higher as I progressed. The sky above narrowed to a ribbon of gray between the edges of the cliff faces. The trees that had lined the rim when I began my descent were now barely visible, just dark silhouettes against the fading light. That sense of wrongness I'd felt earlier intensified with each step. The air seemed to thicken around me, making each breath slightly more effortful than it should have been. The silence was absolute, unnatural. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even the normal creaking of trees in the wind. Just the soft crunch of my boots breaking through the crust of snow, and my increasingly ragged breathing. I was about halfway through the ravine when I first noticed the markings. At first I thought they were just unusual patterns in the rock face to my right, perhaps mineral deposits or water stains. But as I drew closer, I realized they were deliberate. Carved or etched into the stone were symbols I didn't recognize, angular lines forming patterns that seemed almost, but not quite, like letters from some unknown alphabet. I stopped, staring at them with growing unease. They weren't the work of nature, that much was certain. Someone had made these markings, and not in the distant past. The cuts in the stone looked relatively fresh, the edges sharp rather than weathered. I forced myself to look away and continue walking. Probably the work of local kids, I told myself. Graffiti in an unusual location. Nothing to get worked up about. But deep down, I knew better. These weren't the casual scrawlings of bored teenagers. They had a purpose, a deliberateness that spoke of ritual or communication, and they were everywhere, I realized with growing dread. Now that I'd noticed the first set, I couldn't stop seeing them, carved into rocks, scratched on the frozen ground, even cut into the bark of the few stunted trees that grew along the trail. The daylight was almost gone now, the walls of the ravine lost in shadow. I should have been frightened by the approaching darkness, by the realization that I wouldn't reach my destination before nightfall. Instead, I found myself more concerned with what might be revealed when I turned on my flashlight, what other markings or signs I might find that would be better left unseen. But I had no choice. As the last of the natural light faded, I fumbled in my pocket for my flashlight, flicked it on, and continued forward into the gathering dark, every sense heightened to painful acuity. That's when I heard it, a sound so out of place that at first my mind refused to process it. A laugh, soft, almost childlike, echoing off the walls of the ravine. I froze, the beam of my flashlight dancing wildly as my hand began to shake. "Hello?" I called, hating the way my voice cracked. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the soft sigh of wind through the ravine and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stood still for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, listening intently. Nothing. I must have imagined it, I decided. A trick of the wind or my own nerves getting the better of me. I resumed walking, faster now, eager to be out of this place that felt increasingly like a trap. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the walls, creating moving shadows that seemed to follow alongside me. The trail began to climb slightly, giving me hope that I was nearing the far side of the ravine. And then my light caught something ahead that made me stop dead in my tracks. A structure. Man-made, crude but unmistakable. Some kind of shelter built against the ravine wall, constructed of fallen branches, pieces of what looked like scavenged lumber, and what appeared to be animal hide stretched over the frame. No one should be living out here, especially not in winter. This part of the forest was designated wilderness, miles from the nearest road or settlement, and yet here was clear evidence that someone or something had established a presence. I considered my options. The sensible thing would be to give the structure a wide berth, to hurry past and up the far slope of the ravine as quickly as possible. But curiosity, that most dangerous of human traits, kept me rooted to the spot. Who would build such a shelter in such a place? Was it abandoned or currently occupied? And if the latter, by whom? Before I could decide on a course of action, the decision was made for me. The crude door of the shelter, little more than a flap of hide, moved. Just a slight ripple at first, as if disturbed by a draft. Then it was pushed aside, and a figure emerged. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw him clearly, and every instinct screamed at me to run. He stood motionless in the harsh beam of my flashlight, and I found myself equally frozen, unable to move or even think coherently. The man, if I could call him that, was unlike anyone I'd ever encountered in my years of wilderness trekking. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his body a collection of sharp angles beneath layers of filthy, mismatched clothing. A tattered army surplus jacket hung from his skeletal frame, patched in dozens of places with what looked like animal fur and bits of synthetic fabric. Beneath it I glimpsed multiple layers of flannel and what might have once been a thermal shirt, now gray with dirt and wear. His pants were a similar patchwork, secured with what appeared to be baling wire around his waist. His feet were wrapped in what I first took for boots but realized with a shock were crude moccasins made from some unidentifiable animal hide. But it was his face that truly paralyzed me. Gaunt didn't begin to describe it. His cheeks were so hollow they seemed to collapse inward, forming deep shadows beneath cheekbones that protruded like blades. His beard was wild and matted, streaked with gray despite the fact that he didn't appear particularly old. Beneath a filthy knit cap, his hair hung in greasy ropes around his shoulders. And his eyes. God, his eyes. They were deeply set in their sockets, so dark in the artificial light that I couldn't distinguish pupil from iris. But it wasn't their color that disturbed me. It was their expression. Or rather, their complete lack of expression. They registered my presence with the cold assessment of a predator, devoid of surprise, fear, or any recognizable human emotion. In his hands, he held what I had initially mistaken for a branch but now recognized as a rifle, an AR-style weapon, incongruously modern and well-maintained compared to his primitive appearance. His finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, but the message was clear. He was prepared to use it if necessary. We stared at each other across 20 yards of snow-covered ground, neither moving, neither speaking. The only sound was the whisper of falling snow and my own ragged breathing, which now seemed obscenely loud in the stillness. I became acutely aware of my shotgun, still slung over my shoulder. A wave of fear washed over me as I realized how this must look to him, an armed stranger appearing suddenly outside his dwelling. If I moved to adjust the weapon or, God forbid, tried to unsling it, he might interpret it as an aggressive action. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my empty left hand in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace, keeping my right hand steady on the flashlight. The beam illuminated his face like a spotlight, and I saw his eyes narrow slightly, the first change in his expression since he'd emerged from the shelter. "I'm just passing through," I said, shocked at how steady my voice sounded despite the terror coursing through me. "Don't mean any harm." No response. Not a nod, not a word, not even a blink. Just that unnervingly steady gaze and the unwavering barrel of the rifle, pointed at the ground between us but capable of being raised and fired in a fraction of a second. "There's a storm," I continued, gesturing vaguely upward with my flashlight. "I was trying to get across this ravine before dark. Didn't know anyone was living out here." Still nothing, but something changed in his posture, a subtle tensing as if my words had triggered some internal calculation. I noticed his grip on the rifle tighten almost imperceptibly. I needed to leave. Now. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this man, this place. But I couldn't just turn and run. That might provoke him in ways I didn't want to contemplate. "I'll just be on my way then," I said, taking a careful step backward. "Sorry to disturb you." For a long, excruciating moment he remained motionless. Then with a movement so slight I almost missed it, he inclined his head a fraction of an inch to the left, toward the far end of the ravine. A clear message. Go that way. Leave. I nodded, relief flooding through me. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was thanking him for. Not shooting me on sight, I supposed. Moving slowly, telegraphed my movements, I began to edge my way along the trail, giving his shelter as wide a berth as the narrow ravine floor would allow. He turned as I moved, his eyes tracking me, the rifle still held at the ready. As I passed him, now at the closest point in my careful arc around his position, I caught a whiff of his scent, unwashed body, smoke, and something else. Something chemical that I couldn't identify. It sent another jolt of alarm through me. That smell didn't belong in this pristine wilderness. It was industrial, artificial. I was about 30 yards past him when he finally moved. Not toward me, as I had feared, but back toward his shelter. He paused at the entrance, the hide flap held aside, and looked back at me one last time. In the diminishing beam of my flashlight, his eyes caught the light and seemed to glow with an inner fire. Then he was gone, ducked inside, the flap falling back into place behind him. I didn't wait to see if he would emerge again. I continued along the ravine floor, walking faster now but still mindful of making too much noise. The encounter had left me shaken in ways I couldn't fully articulate even to myself. That man hadn't threatened me directly, hadn't even spoken to me, so why did I feel as if I'd just narrowly escaped with my life? Perhaps because on some primal level I had recognized what he was, or rather what he had become. A human being who had crossed some invisible threshold, who had spent so long outside the boundaries of society that he no longer fully belonged to it. Someone who had adapted to this harsh environment in ways that had transformed him into something almost, but not quite, other. I had gone perhaps 100 yards when a sound stopped me in my tracks. A voice, definitely human, definitely not the man I had just encountered, raised in what might have been song or might have been lamentation. It echoed off the ravine walls, distorted by distance and acoustics into something barely recognizable as human output. I stood frozen once more, straining to make sense of what I was hearing. The voice rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost linguistic, but in no language I could identify. The sound made the hairs on my arms stand on end despite the layers of clothing I wore. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped, leaving a silence that felt heavy and oppressive. I waited, listening for any resumption or response, but heard nothing. After a minute that felt like an hour, I continued walking, now with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. I needed to get out of this ravine, away from the strange man with his modern weapon and primitive dwelling, away from disembodied voices singing in unknown tongues. The trail began to climb more steeply, and I realized I was approaching the far side of the ravine. Hope surged through me. Soon I would be back in the normal forest, away from this place that felt increasingly like it existed according to its own twisted logic. I increased my pace, pushing myself harder despite the treacherous footing. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly ahead of me, creating a disorienting strobe effect. The walls of the ravine began to lower as I ascended, the ribbon of sky above widening. And then, with a suddenness that left me dizzy with relief, I was out. The ravine was behind me, and I stood on level ground amidst normal pines, their branches heavy with snow. The wind had died down during my passage through the ravine, and the snowfall had nearly stopped, just a few stray flakes drifting down through the darkness. I leaned against a tree, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? A man living in a crude shelter in the middle of nowhere, armed with a weapon that looked fresh off an assembly line. Had I really heard that voice singing or chanting in some unknowable language? None of it made sense. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Maybe the storied isolation of wilderness trips had finally caught up with me, manifesting in hallucinations born of stress and fatigue. But one glance back at the dark mouth of the ravine dismissed those comfortable explanations. What I had seen and heard had been real. The implications of that reality, however, were something my mind shied away from examining too closely. I checked my watch, 7:23 p.m. Full dark had fallen while I was in the ravine, and my intended campsite was still of unknown distance away. But the thought of making camp here, so close to the ravine and its unsettling inhabitant, was unthinkable. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place before I stopped for the night. I consulted my map again, trying to get my bearings. If the ravine wasn't marked, I would have to make an educated guess based on the terrain I could observe with my flashlight. After several minutes of careful consideration, I decided on a direction and set off, my pace brisk despite the exhaustion that pulled at my limbs. I would hike for another hour, I decided, then make camp regardless of my location. Pushing on through the night in these conditions would be foolhardy, even with the extra motivation of putting distance between myself and the ravine. As I walked, I repeatedly glanced behind me, half expecting to see the gaunt man following silently in my tracks. But there was nothing. Just darkness and silent trees and the occasional soft plop of snow falling from overloaded branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest that had seemed so welcoming, so familiar just hours ago now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow might conceal an observer. Every rustle of wind through the pines might be footsteps. After what I judged to be about an hour of steady hiking, I began looking for a suitable campsite. I found it in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines that would provide some shelter from the wind. Exhaustion had overtaken fear by this point, and my movements were mechanical as I set up my tent, gathered wood for a small fire, and prepared a minimal meal. The fire caught quickly, the flames leaping up to provide both warmth and a circle of light that pushed back the darkness. I huddled close to it, my shotgun now across my knees, loaded and ready. I had never before felt the need to keep a loaded weapon so close at hand during my wilderness trips. But I had also never before encountered someone like the man in the ravine. As I sat there, the events of the day replaying in my mind, a new thought emerged, one that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. The man had not been surprised to see me. There had been no shock, no startlement when my light fell upon him emerging from his shelter. It was as if he had been expecting me, or at least was accustomed to encounters with hikers who stumbled into his domain, which meant I probably wasn't the first to find that ravine, to meet its strange inhabitant. What had happened to the others? With that disquieting thought lodged firmly in my mind, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and laid down fully clothed, my shotgun beside me within easy reach. Sleep, I was certain, would elude me entirely. Instead, exhaustion claimed me almost immediately, dragging me down into dreams filled with gaunt figures and singing voices and symbols carved into stone. I awoke to absolute silence. No wind in the pines. No distant call of an owl or coyote. Just a profound stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums like a physical force. My watch read 3:17 a.m. I lay motionless in my sleeping bag, trying to identify what had woken me. Some sound, a change in temperature, or just the natural cycling of sleep? Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound. Footsteps in the snow circling my tent. I reached for my shotgun, my heart hammering so loudly, I was sure it could be heard through the thin fabric of the tent. The footsteps continued, unhurried, methodical. Whoever or whatever was out there was making no attempt to conceal their presence. I sat up slowly, careful not to make the nylon rustle. The footsteps paused, then resumed. Now moving away from the tent toward where my fire had been, I heard the soft hiss of snow being kicked onto the remaining embers, plunging the clearing into deeper darkness. I know you're awake. The voice was male, but not the one I had expected. Not the gaunt man from the ravine. This voice was younger, with an odd lilting quality that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I said nothing, weighing my options. I could stay in the tent and hope he went away. I could try to reason with him, establish some kind of dialogue, or I could confront him directly, shotgun in hand, and demand he leave. Before I could decide, he spoke again, closer now. You shouldn't have come here. This area isn't safe for people like you. People like me? I found myself responding, the words out before I could stop them. A soft laugh devoid of humor. Outsiders, people who don't understand the rules. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. What rules? The rules of the valley, the agreements we've made. We, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Those of us who stay here, who have chosen this place. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm just passing through. I'll be gone in the morning. A pause. Maybe, if they let you. That sent a fresh spike of fear through me. They, who's they? No answer. Just the sound of retreating footsteps crunching in the snow, fading into the distance. I sat in the darkness, clutching my shotgun for what felt like hours. Eventually, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent flap just enough to peer out. The clearing was empty, bathed in the faint glow of starlight reflecting off the snow. My fire was indeed out, just a dark smudge in the white expanse. All around, the forest stood silent and watchful. I closed the tent and tried to think rationally. Who had been speaking to me? Another resident of this strange area, obviously. Someone connected to the gaunt man I'd encountered earlier. His words suggested there were others. A community of some sort living out here in the wilderness. But why? What would drive people to live in such harsh conditions so far from civilization? And what were these rules and agreements he'd mentioned? The most disturbing implication was that they might try to prevent me from leaving. That thought sent a wave of claustrophobia through me, despite the vast forest surrounding my tiny tent. I checked my watch again. 3:43 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. I knew I should try to get more sleep, conserve my energy for what might be a difficult day ahead. But the thought of closing my eyes, of being vulnerable again, was unbearable. Instead, I sat up back against my pack, shotgun across my lap, and waited for morning, listening to the silence and wondering what was listening back. The first hints of dawn found me still awake, my eyes gritty with exhaustion but my mind hyper-alert. I hadn't heard any more footsteps or voices since the strange encounter, but the feeling of being watched had persisted through the long hours of darkness. As soon as there was enough light to see by, I began breaking camp, my movements quick and efficient despite my fatigue. The sooner I was moving, the better. My initial plan of spending 5 days in the wilderness was now abandoned. I just wanted to get back to my truck and away from this place as quickly as possible. The question was which way to go. My encounter in the ravine had disoriented me more than I'd realized. Looking at my map in the gray morning light, I tried to determine my location based on the terrain features I could see, but nothing seemed to match up correctly. The ravine I'd crossed wasn't marked, which threw off all my other calculations. After several minutes of indecision, I decided to head in what I judged to be a northerly direction. If I maintained that course, I would eventually hit one of the main trails that crisscrossed the state forest, which I could then follow back to a road. I shouldered my pack, checked that my shotgun was loaded but safe, and set off through the trees, trying to ignore the sensation of eyes tracking my movement from somewhere in the shadowy forest. The day was clear and cold, the storm of the previous evening having moved on during the night. Under different circumstances, I would have appreciated the beauty of the snow-laden landscape, the way the rising sun created diamonds of light on the pristine white surface. Instead, I found myself scanning constantly for signs of human presence, my body tense with anticipation of another encounter. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, I came to another clearing, larger than the one where I'd camped. In the center stood the burnt-out shell of what appeared to have been a cabin. The roof had collapsed and the walls were blackened with soot, but the stone foundation and chimney remained intact. I approached cautiously, curious despite my apprehension. The structure was old, decades at least, judging by the mature trees growing right up to its walls, but the fire that had destroyed it seemed more recent. There was no snow inside the roofless structure, suggesting the fire had been hot enough to melt it, but not so recent that fresh snow hadn't had time to fall. As I circled the ruin, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Carved into one of the foundation stones was a symbol identical to those I'd seen in the ravine. Angular lines forming a pattern that seemed almost, but not quite, like a letter from some unknown alphabet. I reached out and traced the carving with my gloved finger, feeling the sharp edges of the cuts in the stone. They were fresh, not weathered by time like the rest of the foundation. "You shouldn't touch that." I spun around, my hand automatically going to my shotgun. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was middle-aged, her face deeply lined, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore practical outdoor clothing, a heavy parka, insulated pants, sturdy boots, all well-worn but serviceable. Unlike the man in the ravine, she looked relatively clean and well-fed. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I'd intended. She smiled slightly, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "I could ask you the same question. This is private property." I gestured around. "This is state forest land, public." "Is it?" She moved closer, her movements unhurried and deliberate. "Boundaries get blurry out here. Maps don't always show everything." That statement hit too close to my recent experience for comfort. "What happened here?" I asked, nodding toward the burnt cabin. "A cleansing," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "It had been contaminated." I didn't like the way she said that word, contaminated, with a mixture of disgust and fear. "Look, I'm just trying to find my way back to the main trail. I got turned around yesterday during the snow." She studied me for a long moment, her gaze unsettlingly direct. "You crossed the ravine." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "Yes. And you met Hugh." "The gaunt man," I presumed. "If you mean the man with the rifle, then yes. And still you're here." She said this with what sounded almost like admiration. "Most don't make it past Hugh." That statement sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the February cold. What do you mean, don't make it past? She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, he doesn't hurt them. Not physically, anyway. He just convinces them to turn back. He's good at that, Hugh is. Something about him scares people. She smiled again, more genuinely this time. And yet here you are. I shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. I'm just trying to get back to my truck. If you could point me toward the main trail, I'd appreciate it. The main trail, she repeated, as if the concept were foreign to her. Yes, I suppose I could do that. But first you should come with me. There's someone who will want to speak with you. I'm not interested in meeting anyone else, I said firmly. I just want to leave. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. That's not how things work here. You crossed the ravine. You've seen Hugh. You've touched the markings. She gestured to the carved symbol on the foundation stone. There are protocols now that must be followed. Protocols? I repeated, my unease growing. Lady, I don't know what kind of situation you people have going on out here, but I'm not part of it. I'm just a hiker who took a wrong turn. She shook her head slowly. There are no wrong turns in the valley, only intended destinations you haven't recognized yet. I'd had enough of the cryptic talk, enough of this entire bizarre situation. Thank you for your help, I said curtly, adjusting my pack. I'll find my own way out. I began walking away, choosing a direction that would take me away from both her and the burnt cabin. I'd gone perhaps 10 steps when she spoke again, her voice carrying easily in the still cold air. The markings Hugh carves, do you know what they're for? Despite myself, I stopped, turned halfway back toward her. No, and I don't care. They're warnings, she said, her eyes never leaving mine. Boundaries. Lines that shouldn't be crossed. Hugh puts them where the membrane is thinnest. The membrane? I repeated, wondering if I was dealing with some kind of religious cult. Between here and there. Between what should be and what is. She took a step toward me. Hugh has seen things, you know. Been places most people can't even imagine. That's why he stays in the ravine. It's a border of sorts. I didn't want to engage further with her delusions, but something compelled me to ask, a border between what? Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were surprisingly white and even. If you have to ask, you're not ready to know. I left the clearing as quickly as I could without actually breaking into a run, wanting to put distance between myself and the strange woman with her talk of membranes and borders. The encounter had left me deeply unsettled, reinforcing my determination to get out of this area as soon as possible. I hiked steadily for the next hour, pushing myself despite the growing fatigue from my sleepless night. The terrain gradually changed, becoming more rugged with occasional outcroppings of rock breaking through the snow-covered ground. I had to pick my way carefully, mindful of hidden crevices or unstable surfaces that might cause injury. As I crested a small rise, I paused to catch my breath and check my bearings. The view from this higher vantage point allowed me to see further than I had been able to all morning. What I saw made my heart sink. Spread out before me was a valley. Not a narrow ravine like the one I'd crossed the previous day, but a broad, bowl-shaped depression in the landscape. And within it, nestled among the trees about a half-mile away, was what appeared to be a settlement. From this distance, I could make out perhaps a dozen structures, a mix of what looked like traditional cabins and more makeshift dwellings, similar to the shelter I'd seen in the ravine. Thin columns of smoke rose from several of them, straight up in the still air. I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. There shouldn't be a settlement here, not in the middle of a state forest miles from any road or marked trail. Yet there it was, undeniable evidence of a human presence far larger than just the gaunt man and the strange woman. As I watched, I could see movement, people going about their business between the structures. Even from this distance, something about their movement seemed odd, almost synchronized, like a choreographed dance where each participant knew precisely when and how to move in relation to the others. I knew I should turn around, find another way out of the forest that wouldn't take me near the settlement. But exhaustion and growing hunger were taking their toll on my decision-making abilities. And there was something else, a curiosity that I couldn't quite suppress. Who were these people? Why were they living here in such isolation? After several minutes of indecision, I chose what seemed like a compromise. I would skirt the edge of the valley, keeping the settlement in sight, but maintaining enough distance to avoid direct contact. If I could make it around to the far side, I might be able to pick up a trail that would lead me back to civilization. I began my descent into the valley, staying within the tree line for cover. The slope was gentle enough to navigate without difficulty, but I still moved cautiously, alert for any sign of being observed. I had covered perhaps a quarter of the distance around the perimeter of the valley when a noise stopped me, voices carried clearly on the still air. I ducked behind a large pine, peering cautiously around its trunk. About 50 yards ahead, a group of 3 people was moving through the trees heading in my general direction. They appeared to be foraging, occasionally stopping to dig in the snow or examine something on a tree trunk. They carried baskets or sacks, but I also noticed that at least one of them had what looked like a holstered handgun at their hip. I stayed motionless, hoping they would veer off in another direction before getting close enough to spot me, but they continued on their trajectory, their voices growing clearer as they approached. They were speaking English but using terms and phrases I didn't recognize, discussing something called the gathering and referring repeatedly to someone they called the interpreter. I weighed my options. If I tried to move away now, the sound of my passage through the snow might alert them to my presence. If I stayed put, they might walk right past my hiding spot. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. In the end, the decision was made for me. As the group came within about 30 yards of my position, one of them, a young man with a patchy beard and watchful eyes, stopped suddenly, raising his hand in a gesture that immediately silenced his companions. "Someone's here," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. He turned slowly, scanning the trees, his gaze eventually settling precisely on my hiding place. I knew I'd been spotted. Running would only make the situation worse. So taking a deep breath, I stepped out from behind the tree, my hand slightly raised to show I wasn't holding a weapon, though my shotgun was still slung over my shoulder, accessible if needed. "Hello," I called, trying to keep my voice steady and non-threatening. "I'm just passing through. Got turned around in the storm yesterday." The 3 regarded me with expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. Besides the young man who had spotted me, there was an older man with a deeply weathered face and a woman about my age, her dark hair streaked with premature gray. "You're far from any trail," the older man said, his tone neutral but his eyes wary. "I know," I admitted. "I crossed a ravine yesterday trying to find shelter from the storm. Been trying to find my way back ever since." The 3 exchanged glances at the mention of the ravine, some unspoken communication passing between them. "You crossed Fuller's Ravine?" the woman asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "And Hugh let you pass?" So the gaunt man did have a name, Hugh, and the ravine was known to these people, named even. "If Hugh is the man with the rifle, then yes," I said cautiously. He didn't seem happy about it, but he let me go by. Another exchange of glances, this one accompanied by raised eyebrows and a slight headshake from the older man. "Interesting," the young man said finally. "Very interesting." He studied me intently as if trying to discern something written on my face. "You'd better come with us." "Thanks, but I'm really just trying to find my way out of here," I said, taking a small step backward. "If you could point me toward the nearest trail or road." "That wasn't a suggestion," the older man interrupted, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his holstered gun. "Not threatening exactly, but a clear reminder of its presence. The interpreter will want to speak with you." There it was again, the interpreter. Some kind of leader, apparently, of this strange community. I considered my options. I could try to run, but the odds of outpacing 3 people who knew the terrain in my exhausted state seemed poor. I could refuse, potentially escalating the situation to violence. Or I could comply, at least temporarily, while looking for an opportunity to escape later. "All right," I said, choosing the path of least resistance. "Lead the way." The young man nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'm Micah," he said. "This is Jeremiah," he indicated the older man. "And Constance." The woman nodded curtly in acknowledgement. "Theodore," I replied, using my full name rather than my usual nickname. Something told me it might be better if these people didn't know me too well. "Come along, Theodore," Constance said, gesturing for me to join them. "It's not far." As we walked, I tried to engage them in conversation, hoping to learn more about their community and, more importantly, how I might get away from it. But they were not forthcoming, answering direct questions with monosyllables or vague deflections, and otherwise maintaining a silence that grew increasingly uncomfortable as we approached the settlement. Up close, the dwellings looked even more incongruous than they had from a distance. Some were surprisingly well-constructed log cabins that would not have looked out of place in any remote area. Others were ramshackle affairs of scavenged materials, plywood, corrugated metal, tarps, and branches. Yet they were arranged with a certain logic, forming a rough circle around a central open area where a large fire pit was currently unlit. People moved about the settlement, engaged in various tasks, chopping wood, carrying water from what appeared to be a central well, repairing structures. All stopped to watch as our small group entered the clearing, their faces uniformly impassive, but their eyes curious and evaluating. I counted about 20 adults of various ages and a handful of children, all dressed in practical but mismatched outdoor clothing similar to what my escorts wore. None appeared malnourished or obviously ill, which surprised me given their apparent isolation. If anything, they looked healthy and robust, their movements efficient and purposeful. Micah led us to one of the larger cabins on the far side of the clearing. Unlike most of the other structures, this one showed signs of decoration, intricate carvings around the doorframe and windows, patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the symbols I'd seen in the ravine and on the foundation stone of the burnt cabin. Micah knocked on the door in a pattern, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. A voice from within called something I couldn't make out, and Micah opened the door, gesturing for me to enter. "The interpreter will see you alone," he said, his tone making it clear this was not negotiable. I hesitated, reluctant to go where I couldn't be observed by others, where anything might happen without witnesses. "Your weapon stays out here," Jeremiah added, gesturing to my shotgun. That decided me. "No," I said firmly. "The gun stays with me or I don't go in." Jeremiah's expression darkened, but Micah placed a hand on his arm. "It's all right," he said. "The interpreter won't mind. He's curious about this one." The "this one" sent another chill through me, but I managed to keep my expression neutral as Micah opened the door wider, again indicating I should enter. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the cabin, unsure of what or who awaited me inside. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by a combination of natural light, filtering through small windows, and several oil lamps placed strategically around the single room. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, sage, I thought, and something else I couldn't identify, something acrid that made my nostrils sting. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I took in the contents of the cabin. The walls were lined with shelves holding an eclectic collection of items. Books, many with cracked spines and yellowed pages, glass jars containing liquids or dried plants, rocks and crystals, animal bones arranged in patterns, and more disturbing objects I couldn't immediately identify. In the center of the room stood a large table covered with maps and papers, weighed down at the corners with what appeared to be chunks of raw metal ore, and seated behind this table was a man who could only be the interpreter. He was older than I had expected, perhaps in his 70s, with a shock of white hair that stood out starkly against his deeply tanned, weather-beaten face. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless in the dim light, and they fixed on me with an intensity that was almost physical in its force. Unlike the others I'd encountered, he was dressed not in outdoor gear but in what appeared to be a hand-sewn robe of undyed wool that hung loosely on his thin frame. Around his neck hung multiple necklaces, leather cords from which dangled small objects, stones, carved figures, metal trinkets. "The crosser of boundaries," he said by way of greeting, his voice surprisingly strong and clear for a man of his apparent age. "Sit." He gestured to a stool on my side of the table. I remained standing, my hand resting lightly on my shotgun. "I prefer to stand." He smiled slightly, revealing teeth stained dark by some substance. "As you wish. You are wary. This is wise. Who are you people?" I asked, deciding direct questions were my best approach. "What is this place?" "Questions," he murmured, as if the concept delighted him. "Always questions from your kind. Never observations, never silent understanding." He leaned forward, those pale eyes boring into mine. "But I will answer in my fashion. We are the Watchers. This place is the threshold. And I am the one who interprets. Riddles, not answers. My frustration must have shown on my face because he laughed, a dry sound like leaves rustling. You want concrete explanations, yes? Facts and figures that fit into your orderly world? He waved a dismissive hand. We are people who have chosen to live apart from your society. Some came seeking escape from laws or debts or personal demons. Others were drawn by other forces. His gaze grew distant for a moment, forces they perhaps did not understand even as they obeyed them. And you? I asked. What brought you here? His focus snapped back to me, sharp as a blade. Knowledge, he said simply. The kind that cannot be found in universities or libraries. The kind that lives in the spaces between established truths. I shifted uncomfortably. The man spoke like someone deep in the grip of delusion, yet there was an undeniable charisma about him, a certainty that made even his most bizarre statements sound reasonable. Look, I said, trying a different approach. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me, but I really just want to find my way back to the main trail. If someone could point me in the right direction. You crossed the ravine, he interrupted, his tone making it clear this fact overrode all other considerations. Hugh allowed you passage. This has not happened in a very long time. Why is that significant? I asked, increasingly frustrated with the cryptic nature of the conversation. The interpreter studied me for a long moment before responding. Hugh guards the boundary. He turns away those who are not compatible with what lies beyond. That he permitted you to cross suggests a recognition, conscious or otherwise, of some quality within you that resonates with our purpose here. And what purpose is that exactly? We observe, he said simply. We document. We prepare. Prepare for what? His smile widened, revealing more of those stained teeth. For what is coming. For what has always been coming, since the first human looked up at the stars and realized that the universe is vast beyond comprehension, and that we are not, have never been, alone in it. Great. Some kind of doomsday cult then. With the usual fixation on cosmic forces and impending doom, I'd encountered similar groups before, though never one that had gone to the extreme of establishing a permanent settlement in the wilderness. Right, I said, not bothering to hide my skepticism. Well, I wish you luck with your preparation, but I really do need to be on my way. The interpreter shook his head slowly. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Theodore. A chill ran through me at his use of my name, which I didn't recall giving him. Why not? Because you have seen too much. Because you have crossed boundaries that cannot be uncrossed. Because you might be useful to us. He leaned back, his expression now calculating. The storm that brought you here was not natural. Nothing that happens within the valley is truly natural, in the sense that you understand the term. I had a sudden, visceral flashback to the strange quality of the wind the previous day, the way it had seemed to come from multiple directions at once, driving me toward the ravine. Could it have been somehow manipulated? The rational part of my mind rejected the idea outright, but a deeper, more primitive instinct wasn't so sure. We've been watching you, the interpreter continued, since the moment you entered the outer perimeter of the valley. We watch everyone who comes near. Most are redirected, their paths subtly altered so they never approach the ravine. But you, he pointed a long bony finger at me, you were not so easily turned aside. Your mind has a certain resistance to suggestion. This is rare. This is valuable. The implication sent another wave of unease through me. Had they somehow tried to influence my thoughts, my decisions? The very idea seemed absurd, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to his claims, something that explained the series of poor judgments that had led me to this place. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice harsher than I'd intended. And I don't care. I'm leaving now. I turned toward the door, half expecting to find it locked or blocked, but it stood slightly ajar just as I'd left it. I took a step toward it. You're free to go, the interpreter said from behind me, his tone mild. We don't hold people against their will. That would be counterproductive. I paused, suspicion warring with relief. Just like that? Just like that, he echoed. Though I would advise waiting until morning. The forest can be treacherous after dark, especially for those unfamiliar with its peculiarities. The mention of darkness reminded me that I'd already lost most of a day to this strange detour. If I left now, I might have 3 or 4 hours of daylight remaining, possibly enough to get well clear of this settlement before having to make camp. "I'll take my chances," I said firmly. The interpreter shrugged, a gesture that seemed incongruous with his otherwise mystic demeanor. "As you wish. But before you go—" He reached beneath the table and produced a small cloth pouch which he slid across the surface toward me. "Take this. It may prove useful if you encounter difficulties." I made no move to take it. "What is it?" "Protection," he said simply. "Of a sort your science would not recognize, but effective nonetheless." I left the pouch where it lay. "No, thank you." He smiled as if I'd confirmed something for him. "As you wish. The door is there. No one will stop you." I backed toward the exit, unwilling to turn my back on him completely. When I reached the door, I pushed it open, half expecting to find Micah, Jeremiah, and Constance waiting to prevent my departure. But only Micah stood there, and he merely nodded at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm leaving," I told him, a challenge in my voice. "I heard," he replied evenly. "I'll walk you to the edge of the settlement. After that, you're on your own." I was surprised by the offer, but nodded my acceptance. As we walked through the central clearing, I was conscious of eyes following our progress. The entire community seemed to pause in their activities to watch me leave. Their faces remained impassive, but there was something in their collective gaze that unsettled me deeply. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of expectation, as if they were waiting to see what would happen next. Micah led me to the northern edge of the settlement, where the trees grew close to the last of the dwellings. "The main trail is about 4 miles that way," he said, pointing. "If you maintain a straight course, you should reach it before dark." "Thank you," I said, genuinely grateful for this concrete information after so many cryptic exchanges. He studied me for a moment, then said, "You should have taken what he offered." "The pouch? Why?" Micah's expression grew troubled. "The valley has its own rules, its own inhabitants. Not all of them are like us." He glanced back toward the settlement, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you hear singing, don't listen. If you see lights among the trees, don't follow them. And if you feel like you're being watched—" He broke off, shaking his head. "What?" I prompted, a fresh wave of unease washing over me. "Then you are," he finished simply. "Good luck, Theodore. I hope you find your way home." With that, he turned and walked back toward the settlement, leaving me alone at the edge of the forest, his warnings echoing in my mind. I checked my watch, just past 2 p.m. If Micah was right about the distance, and if I maintained a good pace, I should indeed reach the main trail before darkness fell. With that goal firmly in mind, I adjusted my pack, ensured my shotgun was easily accessible, and set off into the trees, determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and the strange community of watchers. As I walked, I tried to process what I'd learned, to make sense of the interpreter's claims and Micah's warnings. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ramblings of an isolated cult that had developed its own mythology to explain or justify its existence. But another part, a part that grew louder with each step I took deeper into the silent forest, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something genuine behind their beliefs, something real that they had encountered in this remote place. The forest seemed different now, charged with a tension I hadn't noticed before. The spaces between the trees felt watchful, alert. The quality of the silence had changed from peaceful to expectant, as if the entire woodland was holding its breath, waiting for something. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was just my imagination, influenced by the strange encounters and lack of sleep. 4 miles, just 4 miles to the trail, then however many more to my truck. I could do this. I had to do this. But as the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened among the trees, I began to doubt. According to my watch, I'd been walking for over 2 hours, maintaining a steady pace that should have covered the distance Micah had indicated. But there was no sign of the trail, no break in the endless procession of pines and bare-branched deciduous trees. Had he lied? Sent me in the wrong direction deliberately? Or was I simply lost again, veering off course without realizing it? I stopped, taking stock of my situation. The sun, visible only as a diffuse glow through the clouds and trees, was definitely lower now, perhaps an hour or two from setting. I needed to make a decision, continue in my current direction and hope to find the trail, or make camp here and resume my attempt in the morning. The thought of spending another night in these woods, with all I now knew or thought I knew about what lurked within them, was deeply unappealing. But pushing on in failing light carried its own risks. As I stood there weighing my options, a sound reached me through the still air, faint but unmistakable. Singing. A human voice, haunting and beautiful, singing words I couldn't make out, but in a melody that seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to something ancient and instinctual within me. Micah's warning flashed through my mind. If you hear singing, don't listen. But it was too late. I was already listening, already turning my head to locate the source of that ethereal voice. It seemed to be coming from somewhere to my left, deeper into the forest. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving toward it, drawn by a compulsion that overrode my earlier determination to find the trail. The voice was enchanting, in the most literal sense of the word. It promised answers, understanding, an end to fear and confusion. I had taken perhaps 20 steps in the new direction when a sharp pain in my hand jolted me back to awareness. Looking down, I saw that I had absently been rubbing my thumb against the blade of my pocket knife, which I must have taken out without realizing it. A small cut welled blood across my skin. The pain cleared my head, breaking whatever spell the voice had cast over me. I stopped, heart pounding, suddenly aware of what I'd been doing, walking blindly toward an unknown source, deeper into the forest, away from my intended path. Micah had known. He'd known exactly what I might encounter. With that realization came another, more disturbing thought. What else had he been right about? I forced myself to turn away from the direction of the singing, which continued, now seeming to take on a plaintive, almost beseeching quality, as if aware it had lost its hold on me. The effort it took to walk in the opposite direction was immense, like pushing against an invisible current. But I managed it, focusing intently on each step, deliberately plotting my course back to what I judged to be my original direction. The singing gradually faded behind me, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest in late afternoon. The creak of branches, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I checked my watch again. 4:38 p.m. The light was fading rapidly now, the shadows among the trees growing longer and deeper. I needed to find the trail soon or resign myself to another night in the forest. I quickened my pace, pushing through patches of underbrush and skirting fallen logs with renewed urgency. The exertion helped clear my head, driving away the lingering echoes of the singing voice. After another 20 minutes of steady hiking, the trees began to thin, and I caught glimpses of what appeared to be a more open area ahead. Hope surged through me. Perhaps this was the trail, or at least a clearing where I could get my bearings. I pushed through a final stand of pines and emerged onto a narrow, well-defined path that cut straight through the forest in both directions. Relief washed over me. This was it. This had to be the main trail. Micah hadn't lied after all. I had simply taken longer to reach it than expected, perhaps due to my brief detour toward the singing. Now I just needed to determine which direction would lead me back to the parking area where I'd left my truck. I studied the trail, looking for any signs or markers that might provide orientation. About 20 yards to my right, a small wooden post bore what appeared to be trail blazes, colored marks used to indicate different routes. I approached it, hoping for information that would confirm my location on my map. The post held 3 markers, a blue diamond, a yellow circle, and a red triangle. Standard trail markers, but without a map legend. They told me nothing about which direction to take. As I stood there, indecision gnawing at me, I became aware of a sound, rhythmic, deliberate, growing louder. Footsteps. Someone was coming along the trail from my left, moving at a steady pace. I tensed, my hand going to my shotgun. After everything I'd experienced in the past 24 hours, my trust in random encounters was at an all-time low. But this was a marked trail, I reminded myself. It could simply be another hiker, someone normal who might even be able to direct me back to civilization. I stepped back slightly from the trail, giving whoever was approaching plenty of space, trying to appear non-threatening while remaining ready to defend myself if necessary. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure rounded a bend in the trail about 50 yards away. Even at that distance, I recognized him immediately. The gaunt form, the layers of mismatched clothing, the rifle held casually, but ready. Hugh. My heart began to pound. What was he doing here so far from his ravine? Had he followed me? Been sent to find me? He hadn't spotted me yet, his gaunt face angled slightly downward as he walked. I had a moment to decide, stand my ground or retreat into the forest. Before I could make a choice, Hugh's head came up and his dark, sunken eyes locked directly on me, as if he'd known exactly where to look. He stopped walking, his posture shifting subtly from casual movement to alert stillness. We stared at each other across the diminishing distance, a repeat of our first encounter, but now without the barrier of the ravine between us. "You're still here," he said, his voice a raspy growl that carried clearly in the still air. It was the first time I'd heard him speak, and something about the sound of it made my skin crawl. "I'm leaving," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just trying to find my way back to the parking area." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those unsettling eyes. "Are you? Is that really what you're trying to find?" The cryptic question irritated me. More riddles, more obfuscation. "Yes," I said firmly. "That's exactly what I'm trying to find." "Which way is it?" Hugh shifted his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at me, but adjusting his grip in a way that reminded me of its presence. "You went to the settlement. You spoke with the interpreter." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "Yes." "And now you think you can just leave? Walk away, forget what you've seen?" There was something almost like amusement in his tone, but it was a cold, humorless kind. "That's the plan," I said, tension making my voice harder than I'd intended. Hugh shook his head slowly. "The valley doesn't work that way. It remembers those who enter it, marks them in ways they don't always recognize until later." "Look," I said, fatigue and fear making me reckless. "I don't know what kind of game you people are playing out here, but I'm not interested. I just want to go home." "Home," Hugh repeated as if the word were foreign to him. "And where is that exactly?" The question caught me off guard. "Lansing," I said automatically. Hugh nodded as if I'd confirmed something for him. "A city. Concrete and steel and electricity. Human constructs piled atop one another, blocking out the sky, drowning out the voices." He took a step toward me. "But you hear them now, don't you? The voices, the singing." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," another step forward. "That's why you're still here. Why you couldn't find the trail until now, hours after Micah told you where it was. The valley wanted to keep you a little longer. To show you a little more." I took an involuntary step backward, my boot catching on an exposed root. I stumbled slightly but caught myself. Hugh noticed, a thin smile spreading across his gaunt face. "The harder you try to leave, the harder it will become. The valley has tasted you now. It knows your scent, your thoughts, your fears." Another step toward me. "It finds you interesting." "Stay back," I warned, my hand tightening on my shotgun. Hugh stopped, but not, I suspected, because of my warning. "You won't shoot me," he said with quiet certainty. "Not because you're afraid of killing, though you are, but because some part of you knows I'm right. Some part of you wants to understand what's happening here." He wasn't entirely wrong, and that realization sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Despite everything, there was a curiosity in me that wanted answers, that wasn't entirely convinced all of this was mere delusion or trickery. "Which way to the parking area?" I asked again, forcing myself to focus on the immediate goal of escape. Hugh studied me for another long moment, then pointed to the right. "That way. 2 miles. You'll see the sign for the trailhead." He lowered his arm, his dark eyes never leaving mine. "But know this. Leaving the valley physically doesn't mean it will leave you. What you've seen, what you've heard, it will follow you, in your dreams at first, then in the quiet moments of your days, until you find yourself drawn back here, seeking answers you don't yet know you need." With that ominous pronouncement, he stepped to the side of the trail, clearly indicating I should pass him. I hesitated, reluctant to come so close to him, but equally unwilling to turn my back by going the other way. Slowly, keeping my eyes on him, I began walking in the direction he'd indicated. As I drew level with him, close enough to smell that strange combination of unwashed body and chemical tang. He spoke again, his voice now barely above a whisper. "The singing you heard, it wasn't human. Remember that when it comes to you again." I quickened my pace, unwilling to engage further with his disturbing statements. As I continued down the trail, I resisted the urge to look back, feeling his eyes on me long after I should have been out of his sight. The light was fading rapidly, now the forest darkening around me as the sun dipped below the tree line. I walked as quickly as I dared, mindful of roots and rocks that could cause a fall. According to Hugh, I had about 2 miles to go, 40 minutes at my current pace, which would put me at the trailhead just as full darkness fell. The prospect of being in my truck, doors locked, heater running, civilization just a drive away, spurred me on. I tried not to think about Hugh's warnings, or the interpreter's cryptic statements, or the strange singing that had nearly lured me off course. Those were problems for later, once I was safely away from this place. The trail was well maintained and easy to follow even in the diminishing light. After about 20 minutes of brisk walking, I began to relax slightly. Perhaps the worst was behind me. Perhaps Hugh had actually given me accurate directions, and freedom was just a mile away. That momentary optimism shattered when I heard it again, the singing. Fainter this time, more distant, but unmistakably the same voice I'd heard earlier. It seemed to be keeping pace with me, moving parallel to the trail somewhere deep among the trees. I quickened my steps, remembering Hugh's parting words. "The singing you heard, it wasn't human." The voice rose and fell in patterns that mimicked human speech, but contained something else beneath, something that raised the hairs on my arms and neck. It wasn't following the trail, I realized. It was cutting through the forest directly, taking a route that would intersect with mine up ahead. I broke into a jog, my pack bouncing uncomfortably on my back, my breath coming in quick, sharp bursts that frosted in the cold air. The singing grew louder, closer, and now there was an urgency to it, a hunger that hadn't been present before. The trail curved ahead, bending around a large outcropping of rock. As I rounded this natural barrier, I saw what I'd been both hoping for and dreading, a wooden sign marking the trailhead, and beyond it, visible through the trees, the small gravel parking area where I'd left my truck. But between me and that salvation stood a figure. Not Hugh, not the interpreter, not anyone I'd encountered in the valley. This was something else entirely. In the fading twilight, it was difficult to make out details, but certain features were unmistakable. It was roughly human in shape but wrong in proportion. Limbs too long, neck too flexible, head too angular. It stood directly in the center of the trail, swaying slightly as if to music only it could hear. And it was singing. The sound that emerged from it was the voice I'd been hearing, beautiful and terrible, enticing and repellent all at once. As I stood frozen, it opened eyes that reflected the last light of day like mirrors, fixing them upon me with an intelligence that was utterly alien. Time seemed to stretch, the moment expanding to contain just the two of us, the human and the other, locked in mutual regard across a distance that was simultaneously a few yards and an unbridgeable gulf of understanding. It took a step toward me, those two long limbs moving with a grace that defied their awkward proportions. The singing changed, became something that might have been meant as communication, questions or statements in a language beyond my comprehension. My paralysis broke. Driven by a fear more profound than anything I'd experienced in my life, I raised my shotgun, racked the slide to chamber a round, and fired in one fluid motion born of desperate instinct. The report was deafening in the confined space of the forest trail, the flash momentarily blinding in the growing darkness. When my vision cleared, the trail ahead was empty. The figure was gone. Whether hit by my shot or simply vanished, I couldn't tell. I didn't wait to find out. I ran, sprinting the remaining distance to the trailhead and across the parking area to my truck. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside. The interior of the truck was exactly as I'd left it. Travel mug in the cup holder, map folded on the passenger seat. the lingering scent of coffee and the pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. It was so normal, so mundane, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. The ravine, Hugh, the settlement, the interpreter, the singing, the figure on the trail. But the trembling in my hands and the hammering of my heart told a different story. It had all been real, terrifyingly, inexplicably real. I started the engine, the familiar rumble providing a small measure of comfort. The headlights illuminated the empty parking area and the dark mouth of the trail from which I'd emerged. Nothing moved in their bright beams. Nothing sang or called or beckoned. I put the truck in reverse, backed around in a tight turn, and headed down the narrow access road toward the highway, my foot pressing the accelerator harder than was safe on the uneven surface. Only when I reached the paved road, the forest receding in my rearview mirror, did I allow myself to draw a full breath. I had escaped. I was alive. I was going home. But even as these reassurances ran through my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the valley, not physically perhaps, but in ways more subtle and insidious. A memory, a mark, a connection that wouldn't easily be severed. The valley doesn't work that way, Hugh had said, and it remembers those who enter it, marks them, in ways they don't always recognize until later. As the miles between me and the forest increased, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever strangeness I had encountered was confined to that remote area and would remain there, fading from my memory like a bad dream. I almost believed it too. For a while, 3 months passed. Spring replaced winter. The snow melted and life returned to its normal rhythms. I went back to my job at the community college library, paid my bills, met friends for dinner, watched movies on weekends. Normal activities, safe activities. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened in the Pigeon River forest. How could I? The story sounded deranged even in my own head. A hidden community of cultists living in the wilderness, a gaunt guardian of a mystical ravine, an interpreter of cosmic mysteries, a singing entity that wasn't human. Instead, I told a sanitized version to those who asked about my trip. Bad weather, got a bit lost, decided to cut it short. Nobody questioned this. Solo winter camping trips going awry was hardly an unusual occurrence in northern Michigan. But while I might have kept the story to myself, I couldn't escape its effects. Sleep became problematic. I would lie awake for hours, listening for sounds that weren't there, tensing at every creak of the apartment building settling. When I did sleep, my dreams were invaded by images from the valley. Hugh's gaunt face, the interpreter's stained teeth, the symbols carved into stone, and always, the singing. I began researching, spending hours in the college library where I worked, combing through local histories, geological surveys, folklore collections, anything that might shed light on the area I had visited. I found little that was directly relevant, but there were hints, suggestions of anomalies that others had noted over the years. A geological survey from the 1950s mentioned a localized magnetic disturbance in the region that interfered with compass readings. A folklorist in the 1970s had collected stories from local Native American tribes about a place in the forest where the boundaries are thin and voices can be heard that have no bodies. Hiker's memoir from the 1990s included a brief passage about becoming disoriented in what they described as a ravine that seemed to shift and change as I tried to navigate it, though they attributed this to exhaustion and possible mild hypothermia. None of it was conclusive, none of it extraordinary enough to suggest that what I had experienced was anything more than an isolated cult, taking advantage of the remoteness of the area to establish their community. But it was enough to keep me digging, enough to feed the growing obsession that I wasn't willing to acknowledge even to myself. The dreams intensified. In them, I was back in the forest, but it was altered, more primeval, the trees taller and older than any that exist today. The ravine was there, deeper and wider, and from it emerged figures that were neither human nor animal, but something in between, moving with a purpose I couldn't understand but could feel the weight of. And always the singing. I began to hear it in my waking hours as well, not clearly, not continuously, but in snatches and fragments that would come to me in quiet moments. When I was alone in the stacks at the library, shelving books in the reference section where students rarely ventured. When I was driving home late at night, the roads empty and dark. When I was in the shower, the sound of the water providing a backdrop against which the distant melody could form. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, memory and imagination collaborating to recreate what had frightened me, a form of post-traumatic stress perhaps. Nothing to be concerned about, but I knew better. On some level, I knew what was happening. Hugh had warned me after all. What you've seen, what you've heard, it will follow you. In your dreams at first, then in the quiet moments of your days. 5 months after my experience in the valley, I received a letter. No return address, no signature, just a single sheet of paper with a message written in a spidery hand. The boundary thins as summer approaches. What crosses in one direction may cross in the other. Remember what you heard. Remember what you saw. Be vigilant. I knew who it was from even without a signature. The interpreter's warning or invitation. The sensible response would have been to throw the letter away, perhaps even report it to the police as a vague threat. Instead, I found myself reading it over and over, tracing the angular handwriting with my finger, looking for additional meaning in the sparse lines. How had he found me? I hadn't given my address to anyone in the settlement, but then they had known my name without being told. Perhaps they had other ways of gathering information, other connections to the outside world that I hadn't considered. The letter accelerated my decline. I began having difficulty concentrating at work, missing shifts or showing up late, staring blankly at computer screens for minutes at a time. Friends noticed my distraction, my jumpiness, the dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep. They suggested therapy, meditation, medication. I nodded and promised to consider their advice, knowing I wouldn't. How could I explain to a therapist that I was being haunted by a singing voice that wasn't human? In June, exactly 6 months after my encounter in the valley, I made my decision. I requested a leave of absence from work, citing personal reasons. I spent a day gathering supplies, not winter gear this time, but equipment appropriate for the warmer season. And early on a Thursday morning, I loaded my truck and set out for the Pigeon River Forest once more. I told myself I was seeking answers, closure, a rational explanation that would let me put the experience behind me and move on with my life. But deep down I knew the truth. I was answering a call. The singing had won. The drive was familiar yet strange, the landscape transformed by the lush greenery of early summer. The forest that had been stark and snow-covered was now vibrant with life. The trees full-leaved, wildflowers dotting the meadows, birds calling from the canopy. I parked in the same small gravel lot where my ordeal had begun and ended 6 months earlier. It was empty of other vehicles, the area less popular with hikers than the more established trails elsewhere in the forest. As I stepped out of my truck, I was struck by a sense of déjà vu so powerful it momentarily disoriented me. Everything was different, the season, the temperature, the forest itself, yet somehow exactly the same. I was returning to a point in space that had marked me indelibly, and some part of me recognized it as sailors might recognize a guiding star. I shouldered my pack, checked that my shotgun was secured properly, and set off down the trail, retracing the steps that had led me to the ravine half a year before. This time, there was no uncertainty about my direction, no confusion about my path. I knew exactly where I was going and why. The forest welcomed me with a silence that felt almost conscious, aware. No birdsong accompanied my passage. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my boots on the packed earth of the trail and my measured breathing. It took less time than I expected to reach the point where I had first deviated from the trail, where the unexpected storm had driven me toward the ravine. Without the snow and reduced visibility, the landscape was different. Yet I recognized it immediately. A certain configuration of trees, a distinctive outcropping of rock, an opening in the canopy that framed a patch of sky. I left the trail without hesitation, moving through the summer lush forest with a certainty that should have disturbed me but instead felt right. Inevitable. The terrain began to slope downward, gradually at first, then more steeply, just as it had before. And then I was there, standing at the edge of the ravine. In the bright light of a June morning, it looked almost ordinary, a natural formation carved by water and time. Its steep sides now covered with vegetation, small trees and bushes clinging to the slopes. At the bottom, The narrow trail was visible, winding along the ravine floor just as I remembered. I began my descent, picking my way carefully down the steep slope. Without ice and snow, it was easier going than before, though the abundance of plant life created its own obstacles. Halfway down, I paused, allowing my other senses to engage more fully. The smell was there, that musty, earthy scent I had noticed before, but now overlaid with the green fragrances of summer growth. And something else, a hint of that chemical tang I had detected on Hugh, stronger now, as if it permeated the very soil of the ravine. I continued downward until I reached the bottom, standing once more on the narrow trail that ran the length of the ravine. Looking in both directions, I saw no sign of human presence, no Hugh, no crude shelter, no carved symbols on the rock faces. Had it all been moved? Abandoned? Or had it only existed in the particular circumstances of that winter day? I chose a direction, the same one I had taken before, and began walking along the ravine floor. The walls rose on either side, not as oppressively as they had in winter when trees and sky had been reduced to a narrow strip above. Now, sunlight filtered down in dappled patterns, creating shifting pools of light and shadow on the path before me. I had walked perhaps half a mile when I heard it, the singing. Not distant or fragmentary as it had been in my dreams and quiet moments back in Lansing, but clear and present, emanating from somewhere further along the ravine. I should have been afraid. I should have turned back, retraced my steps up the slope and back to the safety of my truck. Instead, I felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. I had come back for this. I had always been coming back for this. The singing grew louder as I walked, more complex, weaving patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. And for the first time, I understood that it was not just beautiful or enticing, it was a language. The patterns formed words, sentences, meaning. I couldn't translate it, couldn't have repeated or written down what I was hearing. But I understood it on some level below or beyond conscious thought. It was telling a story. The story of this place, of the ravine, of the valley beyond, of what had happened here and what was still happening. The ravine widened ahead, opening into a broader space, a kind of natural amphitheater formed by a curve in the walls and a slight expansion of the floor. And there, in the center of this space, stood the singer. In the full light of day, I could see it clearly, not as the vague, distorted figure I had glimpsed in the twilight 6 months ago, but in its full, impossible detail. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with a body that suggested human form but deviated in subtle, disturbing ways. The proportions were wrong, the joints bent at angles that human anatomy wouldn't permit. Its skin was a mottled pattern of colors that shifted subtly as I watched, like the surface of oil on water. But it was the face that held me transfixed, a face that was both alien and strangely familiar, features that seemed to reference human expression, while transforming it into something else entirely. The eyes were large, multifaceted like those of an insect, yet conveying emotion as clearly as any human gaze. They fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakable, ancient, and utterly non-human. The singing stopped as we regarded each other across the open space. A silence fell that seemed to extend beyond the ravine, beyond the forest, encompassing everything in a moment of perfect stillness. Then it spoke. Not in song this time, but in words I could understand, though the voice was unlike any human speech, resonating in ways that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my bones. You have returned. As it was foretold. I found I could speak, though my voice sounded small and inadequate in the wake of its magnificent tones. Foretold by whom? By the patterns, by the confluence, by the thinning of boundaries that allows such meetings. It gestured with a limb that was both arm and not arm, indicating the ravine around us. This place has always been a threshold. Your kind has known this in ways forgotten and remembered again across your brief spans. What are you? I asked, the question that had haunted me for 6 months finally finding voice. It made a sound that might have been laughter, might have been song, might have been something without human equivalent. I am what waits between, what watches and records and remembers, what was before your kind rose from your cradles of evolution, and what will remain after you have transformed or perished. Are there others like you? There are others. Not like me, not precisely. We are individuals, as you would understand the concept, but we share a common nature, a common purpose. And what is that purpose? I found myself stepping closer, drawn by a fascination that overrode caution. To observe, to interact when the boundaries permit, to learn. It tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost human, almost vulnerable in its curiosity. Your kind is interesting to us. Brief but intense, limited but imaginative. Confusing in your contradictions. I remembered the interpreter's words, we observe. We document, we prepare. Had he known about these beings? Communicated with them? Was that the true purpose of the settlement? Not as a cult, but as a point of contact, a community of human observers matching the non-human ones. The settlement, I said. The people living in the valley. They know about you. Some do. Some merely sense our presence without understanding. Some fear what they cannot comprehend. Others seek knowledge, connection. It made a gesture that somehow conveyed complex emotion, the one you call the interpreter. He has spoken with us many times across the years of his life. A bridge between your understanding and ours. And Hugh, the man in the ravine? A guardian. One who has seen too much, perhaps. Who has lost the boundaries between your reality and what lies beyond. The being's multifaceted eyes seem to soften. He protects in his way. Keeps those who are not ready from crossing thresholds they cannot return from unchanged. I thought of Hugh's gaunt face, his unsettling presence, the way he had seemed both human and not. Had his exposure to these beings, to this place, transformed him? Was that what awaited me if I continued down this path? Why am I here? I asked, the question encompassing more than just my physical presence in the ravine. Why was I allowed to cross? Why did you call me back? You heard the singing, it said simply. Not all of your kind can. Not all who can are able to bear it. You heard, and you understood, even if your conscious mind could not interpret. And you returned not in fear but in seeking. What do you want from me? The being moved closer, its strange proportions seeming to shift and realign with each step, as if it existed partly in dimensions I couldn't perceive. Nothing you are unwilling to give. Knowledge, perhaps, exchange, a witnessing. It extended a limb toward me, ending in what was almost a hand, almost fingers, but subtly, disturbingly different. Will you listen to our stories? Will you share your own? Will you be a bridge? As others have been before you, I should have been terrified. I should have fled. Instead, I found myself reaching out, my human hand moving to meet its alien counterpart in a gesture as old as conscious interaction. Yes, I said, the word both surrender and affirmation. I will listen. Our hands met and the singing began again, not just from the being before me but from all around, as if the ravine itself, the trees, the air, the boundary between worlds had found voice. And in that moment I understood that I had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning unchanged. I had become part of the valley's story, and it had become part of mine. I still live in Lansing. I still work at the community college library. To all outward appearances, my life continues as it did before, but every few weeks when the boundaries are thinnest, I return to the ravine, to the valley beyond, to the settlement where the interpreter and his community continue their own form of witnessing and documentation. And I listen to the singing, not with fear now, but with growing comprehension. I learn their stories, their perspectives on a universe far stranger and more complex than human science has yet discovered. And I share our stories in return, our brief, intense, contradictory human experiences that they find so fascinating. Hugh nods to me now when I pass through his domain, a gesture of recognition between those who stand at the threshold between worlds. Sometimes he speaks, sharing observations or warnings in his raspy voice. Sometimes he simply watches, his gaunt face impassive but his eyes knowing. The interpreter calls me his successor, though I'm not sure I'm ready for such a role. But I understand now what draws people to this place, what keeps them here despite the isolation and the strangeness. The knowledge, the connection to something beyond ordinary human experience, is addictive in its profundity. I've begun keeping records of my own, journals filled with what I learn, what I observe, what I experience. Perhaps someday they will help someone else who hears the singing, who feels the call of the valley, who crosses boundaries they didn't know existed. For now, I exist in two worlds, The mundane reality of my daily life and the extraordinary reality of what waits in the ravine. The boundaries between them grow thinner with each visit, each exchange, each song learned and shared. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between, I wonder what Hugh meant when he said I would be changed by my encounter with the valley. I wonder what I am becoming, what transformation is working its way through me with each crossing of the threshold. But when the singing calls, such concerns seem distant, unimportant. There are stories to hear, experiences to share, boundaries to explore, and perhaps someday to transcend. The valley waits. And I answer. We were teenagers, 16 and 17, out camping alone in the woods near Millridge Creek. It was October 2021, and the autumn air carried the first real bite of the coming winter. This trip was meant to be our last hurrah before the season changed completely. A weekend adventure away from parents, school, and the suffocating routine of our small-town lives. My best friend Theo and I had been planning this excursion for weeks. We'd borrowed his older brother's camping gear, packed enough food for 3 days, and told our parents we'd be with a larger group of friends. A harmless lie to enable our independence. The first day had gone exactly as planned. We hiked 4 miles into the Whispering Pines Forest Preserve, found a perfect clearing by the river, and set up our campsite with surprising efficiency. That evening, we made dinner over the campfire, slightly charred hot dogs and baked beans that tasted better than any restaurant meal simply because we'd cooked them ourselves in the wilderness. As darkness fell across the forest, we sat by the crackling fire watching sparks drift upward into the star-speckled sky. The river rushed nearby, providing a constant background soundtrack to our conversation about college plans, future ambitions, and the girls from the neighboring town we'd met at a summer bonfire. "This is perfect," Theo said, tossing another log onto the fire. "We should have done this years ago." I nodded in agreement, feeling the pleasant weight of contentment. The forest around us had settled into its nighttime rhythm. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures moving through underbrush, and the persistent, soothing gurgle of the river flowing over smooth stones. That's when he appeared. At first, he was just a silhouette moving along the riverbank, a fishing pole slung over his shoulder. In the fading twilight, there was nothing immediately alarming about his presence. Just a fisherman heading home after a day at the water. When he spotted our campfire, he altered his course slightly, walking toward us with a casual gait that seemed deliberately unhurried. "Evening, boys," he called out before he'd fully emerged from the tree line. Theo and I exchanged quick glances before responding with polite nods. "Mind if I cut through your camp to reach the access road?" he asked, finally stepping into the circle of firelight. He was tall and lean, wearing a faded baseball cap and a flannel jacket that had seen better days. His face was weathered, stubbled, and his eyes, I remember thinking there was something off about his eyes, the way they didn't quite match the easiness of his smile. "No problem," Theo answered. "It's right through those trees." He pointed toward the thinning forest where our hiking trail had led us earlier. The man didn't move immediately. Instead, he stood there, taking in our campsite with deliberate scrutiny. His gaze lingered on our tent, our backpacks, the cooler we'd dragged in. "You boys out here alone?" he asked. The question hung in the air for a moment too long. "Just us," I answered before immediately regretting the admission. "But our friends are meeting us tomorrow morning." It was a hasty lie, one I hoped might deter any ill intentions. "That so?" The man nodded slowly. "How old are you fellas?" 18, Theo lied. He was always quicker on his feet than me. "Where are you from?" "Greendale," I said, naming a town in the opposite direction of our actual home. "How long you planning to stay out here?" Each question felt like a tiny test, an assessment of our vulnerability. Looking back, I should have recognized the predatory nature of his curiosity. "Just the weekend," Theo replied. "Like I said, more people coming tomorrow." The man finally nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, you boys have a good night. Thanks for letting me pass through." He tipped his hat slightly and walked past our site, disappearing into the darkness toward the canyon path that eventually connected to the main road. Theo and I watched him go, and once he was out of earshot, we exhaled in unison. That was weird, Theo said. Yeah. I poked at the fire with a stick. Something about him felt off. Just a strange dude, Theo shrugged. Probably harmless. We tried to recapture the comfortable mood from before, but the encounter had left a subtle unease between us. Our conversation grew sporadic, punctuated by longer silences as we both occasionally glanced toward the dark path where the man had disappeared. An hour passed. The fire had died down to glowing embers when we heard voices approaching from the direction of the canyon. 2 figures emerged from the darkness. One was instantly recognizable as the fisherman from earlier. The second man was shorter, stockier, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Neither carried fishing gear this time. "Look at that, Brad," the first man said to his companion. "Told you I found some campers." My stomach tightened. The casual tone couldn't mask the deliberate intrusion of their return. "Evening again," the fisherman called out. "Hope we're not bothering you boys. My buddy and I are just scouting fishing spots for tomorrow." Even in the dim firelight, the explanation rang false. Who scouts fishing spots after dark? Theo stood up, his posture deliberately casual, but his fists slightly clenched at his sides. "Did you need something?" "Nah," the man said, walking closer. "Just being neighborly." The second man, Brad, hadn't spoken yet. He was scanning our campsite with undisguised interest, cataloging our belongings. "Where'd you say you boys were from again?" the fisherman asked. "Greendale," I repeated, my voice steadier than I felt. "Greendale," he echoed, nodding as if considering the information. "That's what, about 40 miles from here?" The precision of his knowledge sent a cold wave through me. He'd clearly thought about our location relative to home, calculated the distance. "Thereabouts," Theo answered vaguely. Brad finally spoke. "Nice setup you got here." He gestured toward our tent. "That a 3-person tent?" "2," Theo corrected, then added pointedly. "Just enough for us." The fisherman stepped closer to our supplies, bending slightly to examine our portable stove. "Quality gear. Your parents must trust you boys a lot to let you come out here on your own." I felt my heart rate increasing. The statement carried an implication that made my skin crawl. They knew we were underage despite Theo's lie, and they knew we were vulnerable. "Our friends will be here early tomorrow," I interjected, doubling down on my earlier fabrication. "They're coming up from the south entrance. Probably be here around 6 in the morning." The fisherman and Brad exchanged a glance I couldn't quite interpret. "That so?" Brad asked. "How many friends we talking about?" 4 guys from our football team," Theo said, the lie flowing smoothly from him now. "They wanted to come tonight, but coach scheduled a late practice." I noticed the fisherman had drifted toward the edge of our site, examining the trail that led back toward civilization. He seemed to be calculating something, measuring distances or escape routes. "Well," he finally said, turning back to us with that same mismatched smile, "we should get going. Let you boys get some sleep before your friends arrive." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. "We're camping just up the canyon," Brad added, pointing upstream. "You hear anything in the night, give a shout. Never know what kind of people might be roaming these woods." The irony of his statement would have been laughable if it hadn't been so terrifying. They left, not back toward the road as the fishermen had gone earlier, but upstream, deeper into the canyon where the terrain grew rougher and camping spots were scarce. As their footsteps faded, Theo and I looked at each other, the same realization dawning on both our faces. "They're lying," I whispered. "Nobody camps up there. It's all rocky terrain past the bend." Theo nodded, his face pale in the dying firelight. "And they came back without fishing gear. They wanted to check us out again." The pleasant murmur of the river suddenly seemed sinister, too loud to hear approaching footsteps, too noisy to detect danger until it would be too late. "What do we do?" I asked, hating how young my voice sounded. Theo didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the path the men had taken, his jaw clenched tight. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Maybe we're overreacting." "Are we?" I challenged. They asked how old we are, where we're from, how long we're staying. They checked out all our gear. They're clearly lying about camping upstream, and now they know we're alone. The reality of our situation was crystallizing with each passing second. 2 teenagers miles from help, with two grown men who had deliberately sought us out and were now lurking somewhere in the darkness. "I feel like they're sizing us up," Theo whispered, giving voice to the terrible thought that had been forming in my mind. The crackling embers of our fire seemed pathetically inadequate against the vast darkness surrounding us. The woods that had felt so welcoming during the day now seemed to hide countless threats. "We need to leave," I said, the decision solidifying within me. "No," Theo nodded, no argument forthcoming. "Pack only what we need. Leave the rest." Without another word, we began dismantling our camp with frantic efficiency. The tent stayed where it was, a decoy to suggest we were still there. We stuffed our sleeping bags, some food and water bottles into our backpacks, abandoning the cooler and cooking equipment. Every few seconds, we would pause, listening intently for footsteps or voices, expecting at any moment to see the fisherman and Brad returning. The river's constant rush made it impossible to hear subtle sounds, creating a blanket of white noise that could easily mask an approach. "Ready?" Theo whispered after 10 minutes of hasty packing. I nodded, slinging my backpack over my shoulders. We had decided to take the hiking trail rather than the river path, hoping it would be less obvious and that the men wouldn't expect us to flee so quickly. We extinguished the last embers of our fire, plunging the campsite into darkness. For several minutes we stood motionless, allowing our eyes to adjust to the dark. The forest was alive with shadows, each one potentially concealing a watching figure. When we finally moved, we did so with a deliberate slowness that contradicted the panic coursing through our veins. The trail was narrow and root-laden, requiring our full attention despite our desperation to run. Only when we had put a quarter-mile between ourselves and the campsite did we pause, huddling behind a massive fallen oak. "Do you think they're following us?" I whispered. Theo shook his head. "Don't know, but I'm not waiting around to find out." With that, we abandoned all pretense of caution and began to run, our footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles beneath us. The darkness of the forest engulfed us, branches whipping at our faces as we fled from dangers unseen but acutely felt. The forest at night was an entirely different entity than the sunlit woodland we'd hiked through earlier. Trees that had seemed friendly companions during daylight now loomed as sinister sentinels. Every cracking twig, every rustle of leaves sent fresh surges of adrenaline through my system. We had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes, keeping the trail but traveling as quietly as possible, when Theo suddenly grabbed my arm, pulling me to a stop. "Listen," he hissed. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. At first there was nothing, just the distant murmur of the river we were moving away from and the soft sigh of wind through branches. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of human movement through underbrush, coming from somewhere behind us. "They're following," I whispered, the realization like ice water in my veins. Theo didn't respond verbally, just tugged at my sleeve and pulled me off the trail. We plunged into the undergrowth, moving perpendicular to the path, no longer concerned with noise but with putting as much distance between ourselves and our pursuers as possible. Brambles tore at our clothes. Low-hanging branches slapped against our faces, but we pushed forward, driven by a primal fear that eclipsed all physical discomfort. The darkness between the trees was nearly absolute now that we'd left the relative openness of the trail, forcing us to move by feel more than sight. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. The moon, previously hidden by dense foliage, cast enough light for us to see each other's faces. Theo looked as terrified as I felt, his eyes wide, a scratch across his cheek leaking a thin line of blood. "What now?" I panted, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced around, orienting himself. "The ranger station," he decided. "It's maybe 3 miles northeast from here. Should have someone there, even at night." I nodded, grateful for his sense of direction when mine had been completely scrambled by fear. The ranger station represented safety, authority, protection, everything we desperately needed. We set off again, now with a destination in mind. Theo took the lead, occasionally consulting the compass on his watch to ensure we maintained the correct heading. Moving off trail slowed us considerably, but the alternative, returning to the path where we might be easily tracked, was unthinkable. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but whether because we'd lost them or because they were moving more carefully, I couldn't tell. That uncertainty was its own form of torture. "Why are they doing this?" I whispered during a brief pause to catch our breath. "What do they want?" Theo's expression darkened. "Nothing good," he replied grimly. "Remember those news stories last year about hikers going missing in national parks? 3 separate incidents, different parks, but all involved young people camping alone." I did remember. The cases had dominated local news for weeks, with speculation about serial predators targeting isolated campers. No arrests had ever been made. "You think—" I couldn't finish the question. "I don't know," Theo admitted, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." We pressed on, the forest growing denser as we moved away from the river valley. Our progress was painfully slow, each step carefully placed to avoid making unnecessary noise. The distant hooting of an owl made me jump, and a nocturnal rodent scurrying through nearby leaves nearly prompted a yelp before I managed to clamp my mouth shut. The physical exertion of our escape was beginning to take its toll. My legs burned from the constant navigation of uneven terrain, and my lungs worked overtime in the cool night air, but the alternative to continuing, stopping, being found, kept me moving forward despite my body's protests. We had been traveling for nearly an hour when a new sound reached us. Voices, distant but clear in the still night air. They were coming from our left, cutting at an angle that suggested they were attempting to intercept rather than follow our path. "They're trying to head us off," Theo whispered, his voice tight with fear. My mind raced. If they knew where we were headed, if they were familiar enough with these woods to predict our destination. "We need to change direction," I decided. "They'll expect us to go to the ranger station." Theo considered this for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "The highway," he suggested instead. "It's further, maybe 5 miles west, but once we reach it, we can flag down a car." I tried to calculate our chances. 5 miles through dense forest in the dark while being hunted, yet the alternative was to continue toward the ranger station, where they might be waiting. "West it is," I agreed. We altered course, moving at a right angle to our previous direction. The voices grew fainter as we distanced ourselves, but the relief was tempered by the knowledge that we had abandoned our clearest path to safety. As we pushed deeper into the unfamiliar section of forest, the terrain began to change. The ground sloped upward, becoming rockier and more treacherous. Each step required careful consideration, and our pace slowed to a crawl. "We need light," Theo finally admitted after his third stumble in as many minutes. I hesitated. Using our flashlights would make us visible from a considerable distance. "Just for a few seconds," he clarified, sensing my reluctance. "To get our bearings." Reluctantly, I nodded. Theo pulled his small flashlight from his pocket, cupping his hand around it to direct the beam downward and minimize its visibility. For a brief moment, the narrow cone of light illuminated our immediate surroundings, enough to reveal that we were approaching the edge of a steep ravine. One more step, and Theo might have tumbled down its rocky face. "That was close," he breathed, clicking the light off. Too close. The realization of how easily we could have been injured, left helpless in the wilderness with those men still searching for us, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. We skirted the edge of the ravine, moving more cautiously now. The moon had shifted position, casting longer shadows and making the forest floor a patchwork of light and impenetrable darkness. That's when we heard it, a sound so unexpected that it froze us in place. Laughter. Male voices, amused and relaxed, floating through the trees ahead of us. The laughter cut through the forest like a blade, each peal of it slicing into our momentary sense of safety. It wasn't the menacing laughter of movie villains. It was casual, conversational, the sound of men at ease. Somehow that made it more terrifying. Theo grabbed my arm, pulling me into a crouch behind a fallen tree. We pressed ourselves against the rotting bark, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. "Told you they'd run," one voice was saying closer now. "The fisherman. Kids always run. It's like a game of cat and mouse." "You said there'd be gear worth taking," the second voice, Brad, responded, sounding irritated. "They didn't leave much behind." "The tent alone is worth a couple hundred," the fisherman countered. And we've still got the main attraction to find. My blood turned to ice. The main attraction. Us. They were hunting us like animals. They're heading west now, Brad said. Probably trying for the highway. We can cut them off at the old logging road. No way they make it through this terrain in the dark without lights. They knew where we were going. They knew these woods better than we did. And they were ahead of us, not behind. I looked at Theo, seeing my own terror reflected in his eyes. We were being herded, driven in a direction of their choosing. We need to double back, I mouthed silently. Theo nodded, but we remained frozen, afraid that the slightest movement would betray our position. The voices continued their casual conversation, discussing us as if we were prey animals, debating the most efficient way to intercept our flight. "Remember the pair last summer?" the fisherman asked. "The college kids from Portland?" "They were smarter than these two," Brad replied. "Almost made it to the road before we caught up." The implication hung in the night air like poison gas. Other victims, other young people who had been hunted through these woods, people who hadn't escaped. We waited, barely breathing, as the voices gradually moved away, continuing on what they believed was an intercepting path to the logging road. Only when silence had reclaimed the forest did we dare to move. "We need to go back to the river," Theo whispered. "Follow it downstream. It leads to the town eventually." I nodded, understanding his logic. The river provided a clear path, eliminating the need for lights or compass readings. But it also meant abandoning our westward trek toward the highway, our most direct route to civilization. We began moving again, this time heading south-southeast, back toward the river but well east of our original campsite. Every step was taken with excruciating care, every movement calculated to minimize noise. The forest seemed to conspire against us. Dry leaves crackled underfoot, twigs snapped despite our best efforts, and low branches rustled as we pushed past them. The physical toll of our ordeal was mounting. Hours of sustained fear and exertion had drained our energy reserves, and the cool night air sapped our body heat. My hands had grown numb, and my movements were becoming less coordinated as exhaustion set in. "We need to rest," I finally admitted when we reached a dense thicket that offered some concealment. Theo nodded, his face gaunt in the intermittent moonlight. We sank to the ground, backs against the trunks of adjacent trees, our legs trembling from overexertion. "They've done this before," Theo whispered after a moment, giving voice to the horrifying realization we'd both had. "They're practiced at it." I couldn't respond. The enormity of what we'd stumbled into was still processing in my mind. These weren't opportunistic predators. They were experienced hunters who had refined their techniques through previous atrocities. "We need to reach that river," I finally said. "It's our only chance." Theo nodded, pulling his water bottle from his pack and taking a careful sip before passing it to me. The water was lukewarm, but felt like life itself as it slid down my parched throat. We allowed ourselves 5 minutes of rest, an eternity when being hunted, but a necessity if we were to continue functioning. During those minutes, every forest sound magnified in my ears, every rustle potentially revealing our pursuer's approach. When we rose to continue, my legs protested with painful cramps, but the fear of remaining in one place too long overrode all physical discomfort. We moved with renewed purpose, heading what we hoped was southeast based on Theo's watch compass and the position of the moon, when visible through breaks in the canopy. The terrain became increasingly difficult, a jumble of rocks and fallen, trees that suggested we were navigating the aftermath of an old landslide or storm damage. It was during our cautious descent of this treacherous slope that disaster struck. Theo, a few steps ahead of me, placed his weight on what appeared to be solid ground. The earth gave way beneath him, a patch of soil concealing a hollow space below. His right leg plunged into the hole up to his knee, and I heard the sickening snap of bone before his scream pierced the night. I lunged forward, clamping my hand over his mouth, muffling his cry of pain. His eyes, wide with agony and fear, locked onto mine as I held him, both of us frozen in the terrible knowledge that the sound might have carried to our hunters. "I'm sorry," I whispered, slowly removing my hand. I had to. They might have heard. Theo nodded, his face contorted with pain. My leg, he gasped. It's broken. I felt it snap. Cold dread washed over me. Even in daylight, with proper equipment and emergency services available, extracting someone with a broken leg from this terrain would be challenging. In our current circumstances, it seemed impossible. Let me check, I said, pulling out the flashlight and risking the briefest illumination of his trapped limb. The sight confirmed our worst fears. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle where it disappeared into the hole. Even that momentary glimpse was enough to tell me that he wouldn't be walking on it. You need to go, Theo said, his voice tight with pain but resolute. Get to the river, follow it to town, bring back help. I'm not leaving you, I protested immediately. Don't be stupid, he hissed. If you stay, we both die. If you go, at least one of us has a chance. Logic warred with loyalty in my mind. He was right. His injury meant he couldn't travel, and staying with him meant neither of us would escape. But abandoning him to those men... Take my knife, Theo said, fumbling at his belt where he kept a folding hunting knife. And the compass. Leave me the flashlight and some water. My hand shook as I accepted the items. I'll come back, I promised. With help, just stay hidden. A grimace that might have been an attempt at a smile crossed his face, not planning on going anywhere. The joke fell flat against the gravity of our situation. I helped him extract his broken leg from the hole, each movement drawing muffled groans of pain from him. Then, using branches and the emergency blanket from his pack, I constructed a rudimentary shelter, concealing him as best I could among the fallen logs and underbrush. If they come, he whispered as I prepared to leave, don't come back for me. Go straight to the police. I couldn't respond to that, couldn't acknowledge the possibility that I might return to find him gone, or worse. Instead, I gripped his shoulder, a wordless promise to do everything humanly possible to save him. With one last look at my friend, partially concealed in his makeshift hiding place, I turned and continued down the slope alone. The forest seemed different once I was alone, vaster, more threatening, the darkness between the trees deeper and more impenetrable. Each step away from Theo felt like a betrayal, despite knowing it was our only chance for survival. I moved with renewed caution, hyper-aware that I now carried the responsibility for both our lives. The weight of Theo's knife in my pocket provided minimal comfort. Against two grown men, it would offer little advantage, but it was better than nothing. My progress was excruciatingly slow. Without Theo's natural sense of direction, I had to rely solely on the compass, checking it frequently to ensure I maintained a southeastern heading. The terrain continued to challenge me, steep in some places, boggy in others, always uneven and treacherous in the dark. After what felt like hours but was likely only 45 minutes, I detected a change in the ambient sound of the forest. The background noise had shifted, incorporating a familiar rushing that could only be water. The river, I had found it. Relief and renewed determination surged through me. The river meant a clear path, a landmark that couldn't be missed, a route that eventually led to civilization. I quickened my pace, drawn toward the sound. When I finally broke through the underbrush to the riverbank, the openness of the space was jarring after so many hours confined within dense forest. The river gleamed silver in the moonlight, wider and faster than it had been at our campsite upstream. Its persistent rush drowned out the smaller sounds of the forest, creating a blanket of white noise that was both comforting and concerning. I wouldn't hear anyone approaching over that sound. I crouched at the water's edge, refilling my water bottle while trying to orient myself. Downstream was salvation. The river eventually passed near the town of Millridge, perhaps 8 miles from my current position. Following its course would be infinitely easier than continuing through the woodland. As I rose to begin my journey downriver, a flicker of light on the opposite bank caught my attention. I froze, squinting through the darkness. There it was again, unmistakably a flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. I dropped to my stomach, pressing myself against the damp earth of the riverbank. Through the swaying grasses, I could make out 2 figures on the far side of the river, approximately 100 yards downstream. Even from this distance, their silhouettes were recognizable. The tall, lean fisherman and the stockier Brad. They were scanning the opposite bank methodically, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. They had predicted our move toward the river, positioned themselves to intercept us. My momentary elation at finding the river evaporated, replaced by crushing despair. How could I possibly navigate downriver with them patrolling its banks? And even if I somehow slipped past them, the open terrain along the waterway would leave me exposed, visible in the moonlight. As I watched, they split up, Brad continuing downstream while the fishermen began crossing the river at a shallow point. They were expanding their search area, covering both banks. I retreated into the tree line, mind racing. If I couldn't go downstream and returning to Theo without help was pointless, what options remained? Upstream led deeper into the wilderness, away from civilization. West still meant attempting to reach the highway, but now I knew they were monitoring that escape route as well. A terrible sense of being trapped closed in around me. These men knew the area intimately, had experience hunting people through these woods, and had the advantage of numbers and familiarity. What chance did a single teenager have against such odds? The answer came to me not as a strategic revelation, but as a simple, primal understanding. I couldn't outrun them, couldn't outfight them, but perhaps I could outthink them. They expected movement. They were searching for fleeing prey. What if, instead of running, I hid, not temporarily, not as a brief respite, but as a deliberate strategy, concealing myself until daylight when other hikers might appear, or until the men abandoned their search. The idea went against every instinct screaming for me to flee, but the more I considered it, the more it seemed like my only viable option. I needed a hiding place that would conceal me completely, somewhere they wouldn't think to look thoroughly. I retreated deeper into the forest, moving parallel to the river but staying within the tree line. My eyes now well adjusted to the darkness, scanned for possibilities, hollow logs, dense thickets, anything that might serve as concealment. After 20 minutes of careful searching, I found it a massive oak tree, ancient and gnarled, with a split in its trunk near the base. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it widened inside to a hollow space created by rot and age. With a final glance around to ensure I wasn't observed, I wriggled into the opening, pulling my backpack in after me. The space inside was cramped but sufficient. I could sit with my knees drawn up to my chest, completely concealed from outside view unless someone specifically peered into the narrow crack. The interior of the tree smelled of decay and damp, but it was dry enough. I settled into position, trying to slow my breathing and quiet the thundering of my heart. This close to the trunk, I could almost feel the living presence of the ancient tree. A silent sentinel that had stood witness to decades, perhaps centuries of forest history. Now it was witnessing my desperate bid for survival. I had no way to track time inside my hiding place. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I sat motionless, straining to hear any sounds of approach over the distant murmur of the river. Occasionally I thought I detected voices or the crack of branches, but it was impossible to be certain whether these were real or products of my fear-heightened senses. The cramped confines of the hollow exacted a physical toll. My muscles grew stiff and painful. Pins and needles spread through my legs and the rough interior of the trunk scraped against my back. But discomfort was a small price for concealment. I must have drifted into an uneasy, exhaustion-induced sleep because I startled awake to the sound of movement nearby. Definite, unmistakable human footsteps approaching my hiding place. Every muscle in my body tensed. Through the narrow opening, I could see dawn had begun to lighten the forest, transforming the absolute darkness into a gray twilight that rendered shapes visible but colorless. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the snap of twigs and rustle of disturbed undergrowth. Then a voice, the fisherman's, instantly recognizable. They can't have gotten far. The kid with the broken leg is around here somewhere. My heart nearly stopped. They had found Theo. They knew he was injured. Maybe they separated, Brad's voice replied, closer than I expected. Smart move, actually. One creates a diversion while the other escapes. No one's escaping, the fisherman said with chilling confidence. We've got time. Town's still hours away, even if they knew exactly where they were going, which they don't. Their voices were directly outside my tree now. Through the crack, I could see the lower half of Brad's body as he stood barely 3 feet from my hiding place. If he turned, if he bent down to examine the split in the trunk. "Let's circle back to the river," the fisherman suggested. "If they're separated, the uninjured one would head for the water. Easiest path to follow." "What about the one with the broken leg?" Brad asked. A pause. "He's not going anywhere. We'll deal with him after we find his friend." The casual cruelty in his tone made me physically ill. They were discussing Theo as if he were an afterthought, a problem to be addressed at their convenience. "Fine," Brad grunted. "But I'm telling you, they might have a phone. Could be calling for help right now." "No service out here," the fisherman replied confidently. "Not until you get within 2 miles of town. Trust me, we've got time." Their footsteps moved away back toward the river. Only when the forest had returned to its natural morning sounds did I allow myself to breathe normally again. They hadn't found Theo yet. He was still alive, still hidden. And they had revealed critical information. No phone service in these woods except near town, which was apparently within a few hours' walking distance. Dawn was breaking. The forest would soon be visible in all its detail, making movement more dangerous but also potentially bringing other hikers or fishermen to the area. The men couldn't risk being seen by witnesses, which meant their hunting time was limited. I had to make a decision: continue hiding until full daylight in hopes they would abandon their search, or use their temporary focus on the river to attempt reaching town or finding help. Both options carried terrible risks, but inaction meant abandoning Theo to his fate. As feeling painfully returned to my cramped limbs, I made my choice. I would move, not toward the river where they were searching, but northwest toward the ranger station Theo had mentioned earlier. If I could reach it before they realized I'd slipped their net, I might bring help back in time. Carefully, I extracted myself from the hollow tree, every movement slow and deliberate to minimize noise. The forest around me was awakening. Birds called from the branches overhead. Small creatures rustled in the underbrush, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the eastern canopy. I oriented myself using the compass and the rising sun, determining that the ranger station lay roughly north-northeast from my position, with each cautious step away from my hiding place. I fought the contradictory urges to sprint toward safety and to freeze in place, concealed from danger. The dawning light transformed the forest from a realm of shadows and threats to a more navigable environment. Details emerged from darkness: the varied greens of foliage, the rich browns of earth and bark, the occasional splash of wildflowers persisting into autumn. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the beauty. Instead, I moved with methodical care, placing each foot deliberately to minimize noise, pausing frequently to listen for pursuers. The men's voices had faded completely, suggesting they remained focused on searching the riverbank. But I couldn't afford complacency. After an hour of steady travel, I reached a small clearing with a fallen log at its center. My legs trembled with exhaustion, demanding rest. I succumbed to their plea, perching on the log and extracting my water bottle from my backpack. The tepid water tasted sweeter than anything I'd ever consumed. As I rested, my mind returned to Theo. Was he still safely hidden? Had the pain of his broken leg forced him to reveal himself? The thought of him alone, injured and terrified, drove me to my feet despite my body's protests. The terrain gradually changed as I continued northward. The forest thinned slightly, the underbrush less dense, allowing for easier passage. This improved visibility worked both for and against me. I could move faster, but I would also be more easily spotted if the men returned to this area. By mid-morning, sweat soaked my shirt despite the autumn coolness. The physical toll of our ordeal was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Hunger gnawed at my stomach. My throat was parched despite careful rationing of water, and every muscle in my body protested the continued exertion after a sleepless night. I paused at the crest of a small rise, trying to get my bearings. Through breaks in the canopy, I could make out higher terrain ahead, a ridgeline that seemed vaguely familiar from our hike in. If my orientation was correct, the ranger station lay just beyond that ridge. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions when survival is uncertain, began to flutter in my chest. I quickened my pace, drawn forward by the tantalizing promise of safety. That's when I heard it, a sound so unexpected that I initially failed to identify it. A mechanical drone, faint but distinct from the natural forest sounds. An engine. I froze, straining to locate the source. The sound was coming from ahead, beyond the ridge, from the direction of the ranger station. A vehicle on the access road, perhaps? A ranger making morning rounds? The possibility of rescue galvanized me. I abandoned caution, scrambling up the increasingly steep slope toward the ridgeline. Roots and rocks became handholds as I pulled myself upward, ignoring the scrapes and bruises accumulated in my haste. When I reached the top, chest heaving from exertion, I dropped to my stomach and crawled the final few yards to peer over the edge. The view stole what little breath remained in my lungs. Below, perhaps half a mile distant, sat the ranger station, a small cabin-like structure with a gravel parking area. A single vehicle was present, not the expected Forest Service truck, but a battered blue pickup. Two figures moved around it, loading something into the truck bed. Even from this distance, their identities were unmistakable. The fisherman and Brad. Somehow they had circled around, anticipating my destination. As I watched in horror, they finished securing whatever they'd loaded and climbed into the cab. The engine revved, the sound I'd heard, and the truck began to move, pulling onto the dirt access road and heading away from the station. My first thought was relief. They were leaving, abandoning their search. But as the truck disappeared around a bend, a more terrible possibility asserted itself. What had they been loading into the back of that truck? The question turned my blood to ice. Theo, it had to be. They'd found him, and now they were transporting him. Where, for what purpose? The possibilities were too horrible to contemplate. I scrambled back from the ridge edge, mind racing. If they had Theo, following them was my only option. But pursuing a vehicle on foot was futile. If they didn't have him, if he was still hidden in the forest, returning to search for him meant abandoning any chance of immediate help. Indecision paralyzed me for precious seconds before clarity emerged from chaos. The ranger station. It was unoccupied but might have a radio, a phone, some means of contacting authorities. If I could reach it before the men returned, I might summon help for both Theo and myself. Decision made, I began descending the far side of the ridge, moving as quickly as safety allowed on the steep terrain. Loose rocks skittered away under my feet, small avalanches that announced my passage more loudly than I would have preferred. But speed now outweighed stealth. The ranger station grew larger as I approached. Its weathered wooden structure nestled among tall pines. No other vehicles had arrived. The clearing around it remained empty and silent. I approached cautiously, circling to observe from all angles before daring to enter. The building was simple. A main room with windows on all sides, a covered porch, and a smaller attached shed. The windows revealed an interior that was functional rather than comfortable. A desk, chairs, maps on the walls. After confirming the area was deserted, I climbed the 3 steps to the porch and tried the door handle. Locked as expected. Through the window, I could see a radio setup on the desk. My objective tantalizingly visible but inaccessible. Desperation fueled creativity. I removed Theo's knife from my pocket, unfolding the blade and examining the windows for vulnerabilities. The smallest one at the rear of the building had a latch that looked manageable. I moved to it, working the knife blade between the sash and frame, jiggling until I felt the latch mechanism shift. With a soft click, the window unlocked. I slid it open, wincing at the scrape of wood against wood, and hoisted myself through the narrow opening. Inside, the station smelled of pine cleaner and coffee. I moved directly to the radio, hands trembling with urgency. The setup was basic but functional, a model I recognized from camping trips with my uncle who worked for the Forest Service in another district. I switched it on, relieved when indicator lights illuminated. After adjusting to the correct emergency frequency, I pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday," I began, voice cracking with emotion and dehydration. "This is an emergency transmission from Whispering Pines Ranger Station. 2 teenagers being hunted in the forest by armed men, 1 injured with broken leg. Request immediate assistance." I released the button, waiting for a response. Static hissed from the speaker, punctuated by indecipherable fragments of other transmissions. I repeated my message, adding details about our location and descriptions of the men. After the 3rd repetition, a voice broke through. Professional, female, asking for clarification. I provided everything I could, our names, when we'd entered the forest, the description of the blue pickup truck, the fact that the men had mentioned previous victims. "Stay where you are," the voice instructed. "Law enforcement is being dispatched. Estimated arrival time 30 minutes. Do not attempt to confront these individuals." 30 minutes. An eternity when Theo's life hung in the balance, but infinitely better than the hopeless situation we'd faced hours earlier. "I can't stay," I responded. "My friend is still out there. They might have him already." "Negative," the voice replied firmly. "Do not leave the station. It's too dangerous. Wait for authorities." Logic dictated compliance with these instructions, but logic held little sway against the bond of friendship. If Theo was still free, still hidden, he needed help immediately. If the men had him, every minute decreased his chances of survival. "Please hurry," I said instead of arguing, "and tell them to check for a blue pickup truck on the forest roads." I set the radio's volume to maximum to hear any further transmissions, then moved to the station's supply cabinet. Inside, I found basic first aid supplies, emergency rations, and, most valuable, a detailed topographic map of the area. I spread the map on the desk, quickly locating our original campsite and tracing the likely path Theo and I had taken during our flight. If I could pinpoint where he'd fallen, where I'd left him hidden. The sound of an approaching vehicle shattered my concentration. Through the window, I saw the blue pickup returning, dust billowing behind it as it sped up the access road toward the station. They were coming back. Time slowed to a crawl as the truck drew nearer. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the station. 30 seconds to make a decision that might determine whether I lived or died. Hide inside? No. They'd likely enter the building, and being trapped indoors with them eliminated any advantage of mobility or surprise. Run back into the forest? Possible, but they'd see me fleeing across the clearing and I'd lose my best chance of learning Theo's fate. As the truck rounded the final bend in the access road, clarity struck like lightning. The shed, connected to the main building but with its own entrance, it might contain tools or weapons and would provide concealment with the option of escape. I snatched the map from the desk, folding it hastily and stuffing it in my pocket. The radio I left on, a beacon for the authorities en route. Then I slipped through the doorway connecting the main room to the shed, pulling it nearly closed behind me. The shed's interior was dim, illuminated only by what little sunlight filtered through a dirty window. It contained what I'd hoped for, maintenance equipment. Shovels, rakes, axes for trail clearing, coils of rope, and other tools lined the walls or hung from hooks. I positioned myself beside the door, selecting a sturdy axe handle from the tool rack. My hands shook as I gripped it. I had never contemplated violence against another human being before, but the past 12 hours had altered something fundamental within me. Through the crack between door and frame, I watched as the truck pulled up outside. The engine died, and the fisherman emerged from the driver's side, stretching casually as if returning from a pleasant drive rather than a human hunting expedition. Brad exited the passenger side, moving around to the truck bed. He reached in, adjusting something I couldn't see from my angle. Not a person. Theo would have required more effort to move, but something bulky enough to need securing. The fisherman mounted the porch steps, trying the front door. Finding it locked, he moved to the window I'd entered through, which I'd failed to close completely in my haste. "Someone's been here," he called to Brad. "Window's open." "Recently?" Brad asked, hand moving to his waistband, where I caught the unmistakable outline of a handgun. "Can't tell. But the other kid was heading this way." The fisherman pushed the window wider and hoisted himself through with practiced ease. I held my breath as his footsteps moved across the main room, approaching the shed door. The axe handle felt slippery in my sweating palms. "Radio's on," I heard him say. "Shit. Brad, get in here." More footsteps as Brad presumably entered through the window as well. Their voices lowered to urgent murmurs I couldn't quite make out. Then louder. "We need to move now. If he called for help." "What about the other one?" Brad interrupted. "Leave him. We've got what we came for." Hope surged through me. Theo was still out there, still hidden. They hadn't found him. The fisherman's footsteps moved back toward the window. Brad's followed, but then paused near the shed door. "Should check in here first," he said. Kid could be hiding. My muscles tensed, every nerve ending electrified with fear and determination. If he opened that door, I would have one chance. One desperate swing to disable him before the gun came into play. The doorknob turned. The door began to swing inward. I raised the axe handle. Brad's face appeared in the widening gap, his expression shifting from caution to shock as he registered my presence. His hand moved toward his waistband. I swung with every ounce of strength fear had granted me, the wooden handle connecting with his forearm with a sickening crack. He howled in pain, the gun dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. "Brad?" The fisherman's voice sharp with alarm. No time to think. I kicked the fallen gun deeper into the shed's shadows and lunged forward, ramming my shoulder into Brad's midsection. He staggered backward, off balance from pain and surprise, colliding with the fisherman who had rushed to investigate. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs, giving me the opening I needed. I leaped over them, racing for the exit. Freedom was 3 strides away when a hand clamped around my ankle, yanking me down. My chin struck the wooden floor, pain exploding through my jaw. "Got you now, you little..." The fisherman's curse was cut short as I twisted, driving my free heel into his face. His grip loosened enough for me to scramble forward, fingers clawing at floorboards for purchase. Brad was recovering, lurching to his feet despite his injured arm. The gun was gone, but he had a hunting knife in his hand, the blade catching sunlight from the window. "No more running," he snarled, blood trickling from his split lip. "This ends now." Fear threatened to paralyze me, but deeper instincts prevailed. I backed toward the supply cabinet, hands fumbling behind me for anything usable as a weapon. My fingers closed around a heavy flashlight, solid metal, substantial in my grip. "You don't understand," I said, playing for time, watching the fisherman struggle to his feet. "Police are on their way. They know about you, about the others you've taken." Uncertainty flickered across Brad's face, but the fisherman's expression hardened. "He's bluffing," he said, wiping blood from his nose. "No one's coming." As if contradicting him, a faint sound reached us through the open window, the distant wail of sirens. The effect was electric. Both men's heads snapped toward the sound, momentary panic replacing predatory focus. "We need to go," the fisherman snapped. "Now." Brad hesitated, knife still raised, clearly reluctant to abandon his prey after coming so close. "Brad." The command in the fisherman's voice was unmistakable. He was already moving toward the window. My muscles coiled, ready to strike or flee as Brad made his decision. For one terrible moment, I thought he would lunge forward, determined to eliminate me as a witness. Instead, he spat on the floor near my feet. "Lucky kid," he muttered before turning to follow his companion. I remained frozen until I heard the truck's engine roar to life outside. Then I moved to the window, watching as the blue pickup peeled away, spewing gravel as it accelerated down the access road, away from the approaching sirens. My legs finally gave out. I sank to the floor, adrenaline draining away to leave me shaking and nauseated. They were gone. I had survived. But Theo was still out there, injured and alone. The sirens grew louder, multiple vehicles by the sound of it. I forced myself to my feet, moving outside to flag them down as the first Forest Service truck came into view. What followed was a blur of activity. Rangers, state police, paramedics, the clearing filled with uniformed personnel and emergency vehicles. I answered questions mechanically, providing Theo's location as best I could remember it, describing the blue pickup and its occupants, explaining our ordeal in disjointed fragments. A search and rescue team departed immediately to find Theo, guided by the map I'd taken and my descriptions of landmarks. Another team of officers set off in pursuit of the blue pickup, armed with the descriptions and license plate number I'd managed to glimpse. The paramedics insisted on examining me despite my protests that I was uninjured. Their assessment revealed otherwise: dehydration, minor lacerations, bruising, and the early stages of shock. They worked efficiently, inserting an IV line, cleaning wounds, checking vital signs while I answered the seemingly endless questions from a state police detective. "You mentioned they talked about previous victims," the detective said, his weathered face grave. "Can you remember exactly what they said?" I recounted the conversation I'd overheard, the reference to college students from Portland, the casual way they had discussed previous hunts. The detective exchanged loaded glances with his colleagues. 3 hikers went missing in these woods last summer, he explained. 2 college students from Portland State University and a solo backpacker. No traces were ever found despite extensive searches. The implication hung in the air between us. This wasn't a random encounter with opportunistic predators. We had stumbled into the territory of serial killers, men who had perfected their methods through multiple murders. What were they loading into their truck? I asked, the question that had been haunting me for hours finally finding voice. The detective hesitated before answering. Camping gear based on what we found in the shed. High-end equipment, probably taken from previous victims. They appear to have been using the ranger station as a storage location during off hours. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission. The search team had found Theo, alive but in need of immediate medical attention. Relief washed over me, so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. And the men? I asked. The pickup? State police have set up roadblocks on all exits from the forest, the detective assured me. They won't get far. His confidence should have been reassuring, but something in his expression suggested he understood what I was only beginning to grasp. Men who had successfully hunted humans through these woods multiple times would have escape routes, contingency plans, ways of vanishing that conventional law enforcement might not anticipate. As medics prepared me for transport to the hospital, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see watching figures among the shadows. The forest, so beautiful in morning light, now seemed to harbor infinite threats, its vastness concealing untold horrors. The hospital received us with efficient compassion. Theo delivered directly to surgery for his broken leg, me to an examination room where doctors confirmed the paramedics' initial assessment and added exhaustion and mild hypothermia to the list. My parents arrived in a storm of tears and relief, having been notified by authorities. Their familiar presence was simultaneously comforting and jarring. They belonged to the normal world, the safe world that had seemed so distant during our ordeal. Later, cleaned and bandaged and tucked into a hospital bed, I learned the outcome of the police pursuit. The blue pickup had been found abandoned at an unmarked trailhead 10 miles from the ranger station. Dogs had tracked the men's scent for several miles before losing it at a fast-moving stream. The search was continuing, but hopes of immediate capture were fading. Theo's surgery had been successful. His tibia had required pins, and recovery would be lengthy, but he would walk normally again eventually. When allowed to visit him the following day, I found him pale but alert, his leg elevated and encased in a pristine white cast. "You came back," he said simply when he saw me. "With help." "Almost too late," I replied. He shook his head. "Perfect timing, actually. They found me about 20 minutes before the search team arrived. I heard them searching, calling my name. They were getting closer to my hiding spot when all the commotion started at the ranger station. They left to investigate, and then the rescuers showed up. The realization of how narrow our escape had been sent chills through me. If I hadn't reached the station when I did, if I hadn't drawn the men away from their search, "They'll find them, right?" Theo asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in me. "The police will catch them?" I wanted to reassure him, to say that justice was inevitable, that men like that couldn't remain free for long. But our ordeal had stripped away such comfortable illusions. "I hope so," was all I could honestly offer. The official search for the fisherman and Brad continued for 2 weeks before being scaled back to routine patrols and alerts. Despite deploying tracking dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers, no trace of the men was found beyond the abandoned pickup truck. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole, an idea that haunted my dreams in the months that followed.